Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, Parallel Deku, back with another fanfiction. This is the second part of What If Deku Becomes Grim Reaper. Now before starting, please give this video a like, and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Midoriya's eyes widened at his teacher's words, but his reaction was nothing compared to the loud complaints of his classmates. Gami wasn't all that surprised, honestly. It wasn't like he was attached to any of the kids here except his successor, and the ghost had full faith that his friend would do fine. The lowest score will be expelled. The nice girl from the entrance exam repeated, "It's only the first day. I mean, even if it weren't. That's totally unfair." Aizawa ran a tired hand through his hair and looked over to her. Natural disasters, highway pileups, rampaging villains. The world is full of unfairness. The green-haired teen was brought back to the sludge villain incident. It had only been a matter of luck that he ended up encountering the villain underneath the overpass that day, and a matter of even worse luck that the villain had escaped and captured Bakugo later on. A lot of things ran through his mind that day, and the days after, but never the thought that it was unfair. He was more grateful that the villain decided to attack him actually, as he had the ability to restrain him. He couldn't imagine if some other unfortunate soul ended up crossing paths instead. That would have been unfair. Heroes are the ones who correct all of that unfairness. The boy's hand twitched at that statement. There was nothing incorrect about it from a rational standpoint, but he knew from experience that it wasn't true for all heroes. If you were hoping for a nice, easy 3 years here, I'm sorry to burst your bubble, the pro grilled, Yue will run you through the ringer. Midoriya looked nervously over to his companion, but found no hesitance in his ghostly friend. Of course, it was always a bit difficult to tell, but he had gotten better at it over the years. His worries eased away at the spirit's confidence. That's plus ultra, Aizawa finished. Show me it's no mistake that you're here. The boy first was afraid he shouldn't be here, that he took someone else's rightful spot at UA, that it was a mistake that he was here. But now, he felt the determination flush out any hesitance he had left. We've wasted enough time talking. Let's get started. Bring it on, I'm ready. The first event was the 50-meter dash. He was unsure of how any of his abilities could really help him here. The obvious answer would be to propel himself with another shockwave, but that would likely cause massive damage to the buildings near the track, as well as any students standing too close. And once he realized they were racing in pairs, he knew there would be no way he could fire off a blast without hurting the person next to him. So Midoriya opted to just rely on his natural speed. He watched with interest as the boy from the exam, Ada, prepared to race against a girl who slightly resembled a frog. He wasn't sure what Aether's quirk was, but he knew he was about to find out. As the starting noise sounded, both took off with surprising speed. He watched as smoke plumed from the tubes in Ada's legs, and that confirmed his initial guess about the student's quirk from the entrance exam. It must be a speed-boosting quirk. He easily outran the other girl, and the robot at the end of the 50 meters announced his score to be an impressive 3.04 seconds. The teen hadn't caught much about the girl he was racing against, but based on her form and how she hopped along the track instead of running, he determined she had a frog-based quirk. He noticed her long tongue when it escaped her mouth as she was jumping, and that only strengthened his guess. She had scored 5.58 seconds. Not as fast as Ada's, but still impressive. The next two to go were the brunette and another student with a tail. He had a good idea what the girl's quirk was, as he'd seen it in action in the entrance exam. At first, he thought she could make things float, but as he watched her touch her clothes right before the race began, he figured out it must have something to do with gravity. She only scored 7.15 seconds, but Midoriya couldn't really see how she could have done anything different to boost her score. He continued to watch as other students raced, wondering who he would be paired with. As students got called and the list narrowed, the boy felt his gut sink and hoped the universe would have mercy on him. It did not. Students 17 and 18, Aizawa called out. He walked up to the track. The teen was number 18, but he paled when he saw who 17 was. It being Bakugo, of course. He noticed that Gami stood on the sidelines still. It made sense. His mentor was probably worried about the light that would come off Bakugo's quirk. The ghost did a slow fist pump at him, and he almost snorted at how awkward it looked. But he was officially calmed down now and ready to run. Midoriya noted that the blonde currently had his arms crossed in front of his face. He knew his quirk would be beneficial to this test, and he put that at the back of his head. The starting noise reached his ears, and like instinct, he took off. He heard Bakugo shout something, but he wasn't too focused on it. The boy's explosion-propelled body was flying up next to him, but the teen moved accordingly to dodge a stray blast coming at his head. This pace didn't change though, and he made it to the finish line a hair behind his former friend. Bakugo had scored an imposing 4.13 seconds, but that was to be expected. Gami flew over to him after he crossed the line. "What did you score?" "I could not hear over the explosions." The teen smiled briefly. 6.32. Much better than middle school. The Spectre could see the pride that radiated off his successor. It was nice seeing him like this, genuinely happy and proud of himself. The second event was grip strength. Midoriya knew none of his abilities could help him here, unless he wanted to disintegrate the machine. So he simply focused all his energy on squeezing the life out of the machine currently in his right hand. It was nothing too spectacular, just 56 kilograms, but he was content nonetheless. There weren't too many quirks that could help out with this, but one kid with what looked to be multiple arms did score a striking 540 kilograms. Then came the standing long jump. At first, the teen thought he'd have to do this one without any assistance again, since the shockwave from his scythe would again be too risky. But a crazy idea struck him right as he was called up. Gami once again watched from the sidelines. But upon seeing a tint of madness in the boy's eyes, he was debating whether to intervene. He took a deep breath at the start, before performing the test as he usually would. He poured his strength into his back legs and leapt. But right as he hit the peak of his jump, he flexed his gloved hand to summon his weapon. Then, with both hands, he slammed the blade into the sand, the long handle now sticking up. As he fell, he reached for the handle again, towards the highest part of it. Once he felt the familiar grain of the wood, even through his gloves, Midoriya used it as support to fling himself off of it, traveling even further than he would have with a normal jump. He touched down onto the sand with both feet a bit roughly, but stable as well, a wide grin on his face. Gami rushed over to congratulate him. That was quite ingenious. Noticing a few of his classmates' eyes on him, he nodded his head instead of very responding. Aizawa was actually one of those eyes, impressed by the boy's creative use of his abilities. But in the back of the pro's mind, he knew that the kid was hiding something about his quirk. The fact that he couldn't erase it earlier confirmed that. The next event was sidestepping, and the teen performed under average for that. But he wasn't too worried based on how he was currently doing overall. Besides, not many students exceeded on this test. The only one that stood out was a small, purple-haired kid that was using RBB-like-S from his head to bounce from side to side. Next was the toss. For this one, he got to sit out as he had already performed it before. He watched as his classmates attempted using their quirks to launch them. Some were successful, like the nice brunette who scored an infinity by making the float into space. Others were not, like the one pink girl who seemingly tried to launch the with her acid. Unfortunately, they just melted instead. When Bakugo walked up for his turn though, Midoriya grew curious. He was positive the blonde would just launch the with an explosion. But he was wondering how far it would go. He walked into the circle and stretched out his arms as the teacher tossed him. Die! Bakugo shouted as an enormous explosion ripped through the air. They zoomed off into the sky. After a few seconds, the bounce to the ground and Aizawa held up the screen with his score, 705.2 meters. The class was thoroughly awestruck at the score, including the reserve teen, but Bakugo seemed to react in the complete opposite way. He growled and dug his fingernails into his palm. How had he scored lower than Deku, who was supposed to be quirkless? And by over 400 meters. He was livid with everything, and his usual seething grew to the point where his hands started smoking. Of course, the pro hero noticed, but recorded it for later. He realized that the blonde held some sort of animosity towards the green-haired kid. That may be an issue later. The sixth event was a display of upper body strength, and despite not finding a way to use any of his powers, he still scored over average. The months of training at Dagobah really paid off. Plus, he naturally had to have a lot of upper body strength to swing around his weapon. After that came the endurance test. And again, he still scored really well even without his powers. Years of escaping bullies at Alder as well as his nightly endurance runs really built up a reservoir of stamina. He was one of the last kids left running on the track and felt proud of that, especially since one of the few kids that outdid him was on a scooter for goodness sake. Midoriya was sure that the student, a girl with spiky, black hair, would place first overall. Her quirk, which he was sure was some sort of creation quirk, was really well-rounded and contributed to every test. Last was the seated toe touch. The teen didn't do so well on this one, but he wasn't that worried. He scored a bit under average again, but it wasn't too bad compared to everyone else. And with that, the events were over. Aizawa grouped the class together once more so he could talk. Moving along, it's time for the results, he explained, pulling out a remote from his back pocket. The pro pressed a button on it and a screen popped up in front of everyone. Upon closer examination, the boy figured out it was a list of everyone's placement overall. Gami realized this too and the two scoured the list for his name. He found his name, ranked third out of the class overall. To be honest, the teen wasn't expecting to place that high. He knew he did well enough to not place last, but he was sure his scores weren't all that impressive. He guessed that his toss score really carried him, along with the standing long jump and the endurance run. He looked at the places above and below him. And first was the girl with the creation quirk, as he expected, now learning her name was Yaoyorozu Momo. Right above him in second was someone named Todoroki Shouto. He wasn't sure which student that was, but he swore the name felt familiar, at least, the family named it. He was sure he had heard that name before, somewhere. And right below him were Bakugo in 4th and Ida in 5th. Being above both made his heart swell with pride, and he considered them both powerful and talented on their own. Though, he wasn't sure how happy said blonde would be once he realized he was above him. His eyes then traveled all the way down to last place, to see the name Minta Minoru. Again, he hadn't really acquainted himself with his classmates yet, so he was unsure of who that was. But he followed the group's eyes to the small, purple-haired kid that had exceeded on the sidestepping test. The student was shaking and sniffling, realizing that he was going home. Most of the class looked at him with pitiful gazes. Also, Aizawa interrupted, "I was lying about expelling someone." The entire class, except a few kids, perked up at that in shock. Midoriya did as well, but not for the same reasons. So did the ghost, but only the teen could see that. That was a rational deception. The pro smiled eerily, meant to bring out the best in all of you. The class of first years all erupted into shouts of chaos, especially Minta. But the quiet boy kept his mouth shut as normal, and instead turned to look at his mentor. "I am thoroughly confused." The child couldn't agree more. It was pretty obvious that it was a lie. The girl who placed first, Yaoyorozu, stated, "I assumed you all knew that too." The duo shared another puzzled look. They hadn't imagined seeing Aizawa seething mad at the beginning when he made the declaration. It didn't make sense for it to be just a lie. Without even discussing it, both were certain that the teacher was going to expel last place, but changed his mind for some reason. "Anyway, we're done here," the hero continued, completely ignoring his class's outburst. "Change and head back to the classroom. Your documents about the curriculum should be in there." And with that, the pro walked away and headed inside himself, leaving the students to now rush back to the locker room. Midoriya trailed behind everyone, not wanting to be swept up in the crowd. He made sure to avoid Bakugo as well, unsure if he would want to attack him after the placements. Once he arrived at the locker room, he made haste to his own locker. Opening it up, he quickly grabbed both his bag and uniform, as well as an extra pair of gloves. He hadn't noticed his signature polyester gloves were starting to disintegrate until Gami had pointed it out at the end of the tests. The ghost's reasoning was that he had noticed it earlier, but didn't want to worry him during the apprehension tests. Whether Midoriya truly appreciated the lateness of the gesture or not was debatable, but he was just thankful that most of his gloves remained intact. He always packed extra gloves for situations like this, his paranoia getting the best of him. But he wouldn't consider it paranoia if someone called it that, just being precautious. And he was always precautious. Finally snapping out of his thoughts, he walked towards the stall he used earlier. But as he passed by the other boys, Ida spoke up. "I must say, Midoriya," he started, "I'm very much impressed by your skills. I really misjudged you." Thank you." The teen stumbled out. "You were pretty cool too. Your quirk is a speed-boosting one, right?" The glasses-wearing boy seemed to straighten up at the praise. "Yes, my quirk is engine, and it indeed boosts my speed." He smiled, and took that last statement as a cue to leave. But just as he was going to take another step, someone else called out, "I must agree. You are a mad banquet of darkness." He turned around to see a student with what looked to be a bird head. He hadn't recognized him though and was startled overall by his sudden statement. "Oh, thank you." He wasn't sure whether that was a compliment. "I don't know your name though." "I'm Takoyami Fumikage," the bird boy introduced, then gestured to his side, "and this is Dark Shadow." Midoriya was about to question the newly introduced Takoyami when a shadowy bird with red eyes materialized right where he had gestured. He recognized the shadow from some of the events back on those school grounds. "That's me." The bird giggled. "His scythe is so cool, Takoyami. Can we keep him?" Said boy looked done with his shadow counterpart. "That's not how it works, Dark Shadow. Though I agree, his scythe is indeed cool." The team looked down bashfully at the praise. Gami would have been weary, but the man was too busy studying Dark Shadow in the moment. He determined that the bird could not see him and returned to his successor's side. Ida jumped back into the conversation, though, "I must ask, what exactly is your quirk, Midoriya? Because you displayed some other abilities in the entrance exam that you did not during that quirk apprehension test." The timid boy got a bit nervous at the question, but calmed himself down. He and the spirit had rehearsed this exact scenario multiple times. He knew it was only a matter of time before someone asked about his quirk, student or teacher. He and the ghost both noticed that the other males in the room immediately tuned in once that question was asked. The others were probably curious as well. He knew Bakugo was definitely listening just to scope him out, though a certain candy cane student was also doing the same. "Well," he started, "my quirk is called Reaper. It's basically got two major parts." When both Takoyami and Ida didn't say anything, he continued. Dark Shadow PP his head curiously. "I can decay living and non-living things with my hands. That's probably what you noticed in the exam, Ida. Though, it works no matter how many of my fingers are touching, so it's a bit strong to control." "I see," the strict student replied. "I'm assuming that's why you wear those gloves." Midoriya picked at his long sleeves nervously and Gami narrowed his eyes. "Yeah." It acts up when I get emotional. My gloves are kind of like the first layer of defense. Takoyami noticed the boy's discomfort and tried to change the topic. What about the other part of your quirk? Well, the other part is my scythe, of course. It's like my own personal weapon. I can make it appear and disappear at will. Dark Shadow seemed to get excited. Is it heavy? The teen snorted lightly. Not really, though that could just be because I'm used to it. Ada still looked confused though. But what about the explosion with the 0-pointer? And the throw? I can basically combine those two parts together, he explained. I can share my decay with my side. That didn't satisfy Ada, but that doesn't explain the explosion. It's honestly just something I figured out. My decay works on a molecular level. So even if my weapon only cuts the air, I can decay those molecules. You're creating a brief, unstable vacuum, and that's where the explosion comes from, he interrupted, becoming excited. I think I understand now. Midoriya looked over at the bird duo and Takoyami nodded, confirming his understanding as well. Whoa, Dark Shadow exclaimed, that's so cool. Indeed, Eda agreed. You have truly amazed me with your ingenuity, Midoriya, said Boy cringed at the name. He didn't really want to go by that during his years here at UA. You can call me by a nickname, if you'd like. I'm not too big a fan of being called Midoriya. He hoped he wasn't being too demanding or abrupt, since neither Ada or Takoyami said anything after. But Dark Shadow didn't seem to notice the tension, if there was any. Can I call you Midori? The teen smiled at the little bird. That's fine. Then I will call you that as well, if that is all right. Takoyami followed right after his shadowy friend. He nodded in confirmation. Ada spoke next. I'm afraid I'm not very good with nicknames, but I'll do my best. Thanks, the teen answered, but I'm going to go change now. Both boys nodded and let him go, so he meandered over to the stall and shut the door. Unfolding his school uniform, he carefully took off his gym clothes and slipped it on, removing the black turtleneck as well. That went well. Midoriya huffed. What? The whole quirk thing or just talking to them in general? The man snorted at his successor's awkwardness. Both. Yeah, they seemed pretty nice, and I think the lie came off well. But after that, no more words were spoken. The boy exited the stall into a near-empty locker room. His gym clothes were now neatly folded in his backpack and his school uniform smoothed out. He had already taken a while in the locker room, and pretty much everyone else had left already. He was about to do the same, when a new voice called out to him. Midoriya, correct. He turned around to see a heterochromatic-eyed boy facing him, a scar covering the spot where his right eye was. You, yeah. Why you are? The student didn't even pause. Todoroki shouted. The teen recognized the name from the quirk apprehension chart. This was the boy who placed above him in second. From the first glance, he seemed cold and reserved, a bit similar to how Gami acted when they first met. But now, the room was filled with tense silence, and it unnerved him. Do you need something from me? Todoroki didn't respond instantly. Gami grew hesitant and moved closer to the boy. He wasn't sure what this kid was going to pull. Are your parents pro-heroes? Midoriya didn't know what to expect, but he surely wasn't expecting that. What? No, the other student narrowed his eyes, but didn't say anything right away. So he tried to reassure him that this was the truth. My parents aren't heroes, they're just. Why did you drive Hisashi away from me? Why did you have to be quirkless? Don't you realize what you have done to me? Normal, you quirkless misfit. Get out of my way. I said get out of my way. People, that did nothing to convince Todoroki though. In fact, he grew more suspicious at the hesitant response. He wanted to press him more, but the teen was growing skittish. We should really get going, he stated abrupt, or we're going to be late. Todoroki didn't want to let this go just yet though. Can we talk after school then? Midoriya was eager to leave the situation, but at the same time, he really didn't want this conversation to continue. But something in his heart wanted to hear his classmate out. He reminded the boy so much of Gami, and he knew how many repressed emotions the ghostly man was hiding. What if he was the same? Maybe talking after school wasn't such a bad idea. Sure, that sounds fine. Midoriya had gone through the rest of his classes with ease, as well as silence, until lunch had arrived. He was so excited to see lunch rush as part of the school staff, and for the first time in years, he ate a meal he didn't have to cook. A warm feeling filled him when he took his first bite, and he knew it wasn't from the hot food alone. The teen found a table to himself, and was prepared to sit alone, as he always had. That's when he could talk to Gami and do his job without any interruptions, or mumble to himself as he scribbled away in one of his notebooks, or analyze a quirk with his mentor. That's what he was used to. That's what he liked. So he was certainly surprised when Ida and the brunette sat themselves down on the other side of the table. Ah, Ida, he greeted. Infinity Girl. I never caught your name actually. She giggled. I'm Uraraka Ochako. Ada immediately began with praise. Both your scores for the throw and your placements overall were impressive. Uraraka smiled. You did just as amazingly. Ada Tenya, right. Correct. But I cannot believe Aizawa-sensei fooled us like that. Yeah, that was sure stressful, she confirmed. Midoriya hummed in agreement. He made me think that this is how it's like at the top, but our own instructor deceived us. The two then devolved into idle chatter after that, with the shy boy chiming in every now and again. He had originally assumed that Ida would be an issue after the events of the entrance exam, but he realized the student wasn't like that at all, just a very serious rule follower. And Uraraka was a very nice person overall. She was talkative and cheery, pretty much the complete opposite of himself. He really wasn't used to this kind of treatment, though it really was just typical friendly talk. It made him wonder how much he'd missed out on during his years of elementary and middle school. Uraraka had ended up asking about his quirk as well, so he explained it as similarly as he did in the locker room, with Ada butting in a few times. She was fairly awestruck when he recounted the destruction of the zero-pointer and clarified how he did it. Of course, she ended up being a bit nosy into the gloves, so he had to explain that as well. So you can decay living things too, right? Is there a limit? Like what about people, or animals, or even plants? Midoriya swallowed a chunk of food in his mouth. There isn't a limit. It works on all that. Ada joined in, so no finger limit or target limit. Your quirk seems strangely unbalanced. Well, that was partially because it wasn't really a quirk, but even then, it had its drawbacks, enough to make him weary of using it. Well, it's a bit intimidating. Any damage I do to a living thing can't be healed. Both kids paled. What? The boy shrunk back. Maybe he shouldn't have said that. I can control it partially. I can touch people as well as objects without my powers activating, but not plants or animals. I've actually never touched an animal since my abilities developed. I don't want to take the risk. The brunette looked heartbroken. Oh, I'm so sorry if I brought up unwanted memories. Ada agreed. I as well. No, it's fine. That's just how I've always been. I'm used to it at this point, he assured them. That's why I wear gloves. Sometimes my power activates without my consent when I'm emotional. I'd rather not put anyone at risk. There was a bit of silence after that, but the stiff boy spoke up. Well, I think it is admirable that you're working to become a hero despite however your quirk acts. Uraraka perked up too. Yeah. Your quirk may be a bit unnerving, but you've put it to good use. Midoriya smiled. Thank you guys. I've never really heard that before. That was technically the truth. He'd never told anyone about his abilities before, so no one had actually reassured him. Sure, Gami did from time to time, but that was to be expected of the man who introduced said abilities to him. Well, that's what friends are for. That took his breath away. Did she just call him a friend? They had only just met. How could she consider him a friend so suddenly? Was that just how friendship worked? He surely didn't know. His first day was turning out to be more groundbreaking than he expected, but he needed to make sure. He needed to know that she wasn't just pulling his leg, like the other kids did at Aldera. He fumbled, we're friends. Ada backed up her statement. Most certainly. Yeah, of course. But even then, he was still weary. The Spectre noticed his hesitation. The poor boy had lived in his shell his whole life. He wasn't used to being coaxed out of it. They seemed like nice kids. The man wasn't sure if that was enough to reassure his friend. But as he turned to look at him, he picked up on the newfound confidence. Okay then. The girl brightened up. Awesome. I'm kind of embarrassed, but I don't think I ever confirmed your name. Midoriya. Deku, right? His mouth grew dry. They were going to make fun of him, weren't they? She noticed his pause. During the test, that Bakugo guy called you that. Oh, she just genuinely thought that was his name then. My real name is Izuku. Deku is just Bakugo's way of making fun of me. Ada scowled. Ugh. And that boy is truly aiming to be a hero. Uraraka kept on with her tangent, ignoring Ada. Well, I think it sounds like Deku. You know, like do your best. I kinda like it. As nice as he thought the girl was. There was no way in his right mind that he would ever let someone call him Deku again. He wanted that name to die with his old self from Aldera. He was really striving for a fresh start here at UA. I'm not really comfortable with being called that. The brunette seemed sort of sad at that, so he did his best to save face. But I wouldn't mind another nickname though. I don't really want to be called Midoriya. And just like he hoped, her eyes sparkled again with newfound purpose. She raised a finger to tap at her chin in contemplation. There were another few moments of silence, where no one spoke a word. What about Midori? It matches your hair pretty well. He snorted at the coincidence. Sure, that's fine. She must have interpreted the huff as something else though. Is Midori not good either? Ada jumped in to help explain. I'm pretty sure he is just amused. Another student from the locker room ended up calling him that as well. That restarted Uraraka's bubbliness. Well, then it must be fate. Midori it is. Everyone at the table laughed, and lunch faded into conversation. There wasn't much time left, so the three ended up having to shovel the rest of their food down to get to class. There were only a couple more hours left before the first day would officially be over, and Midoriya wanted to savor every second. His two friends from before left a bit earlier than he did, though that was only because he told them not to wait for him. He wanted some time to talk with his mentor. So, he began. Midori? Huh. The newly nicknamed teen waved him off. Joke all you want, but I actually like it. Well, that is what matters, is it not? He placed his tray down on one of the drop-off tables. Yeah. The two left the cafeteria together in silence. But at seeing the hallway empty, their conversation started up again. I'm guessing this means no more sorting at lunch then. The boy nearly slapped himself. I didn't even think about that. Shoot, I can't just make them stop coming to the table though. No worries, you will just have to pick up the slack throughout the day. Yeah, I can just work extra in the mornings and evenings. The duo made their way back to the classroom with a little pep in their step. He was a bit disappointed that he would no longer have lunch to chat with his ghostly companion, but the change of scenery was pleasant. Besides, he was glad to have Ida and Uraraka around. Despite Midoriya's greatest efforts to make the day last, the rest of the classes simply flew by. Before he knew it, it was already the end of the last class. After the rest of the regular subject classes, his schedule ended at 1A, which Aizawa clarified would be heroics. But they weren't doing any heroics today, since the pro had already had them participate in the Quirk apprehension test earlier. They were only going over some of the documents handed to them near the beginning of the day, syllabuses and such. Most kids thought it was boring, but the quiet teen didn't really mind. Just the fact that he had gone through the day without anyone hurting him or making fun of him really gave him no room to complain. But eventually, the class, as well as the day, was over. Midoriya sat up out of his chair and swung his bag over one of his shoulders. He paused for a moment, letting a good portion of his classmates exit before him. But that didn't stop Uraraka or Ada from meeting up with him at his desk. Wow, the brunette sighed. I can't believe the first day is over already. Both boys nodded in agreement. Are you two headed to the station? She followed up. Yeah, I am. He responded softly. Indeed, Ada confirmed. Well then, let's get going. The two boys nodded again, and the three made their way to the classroom door. Gami trailed behind, silently observing the classroom. The teacher, Eraserhead, was still at the front of the room, shuffling around some papers. But upon closer inspection, the spirit realized he was sneaking glances at his successor. His eyes narrowed accordingly. Just because his friend admired the hero didn't mean he had to be easy on him. Gami never saw it as overprotecting, just simply watching out for the boy. Besides, it wasn't like he could do much with his transparent form and all. But the ghost desperately wished he could interact with more, because he watched the pro stand up and walk towards the small group of kids. He tensed, but even that wasn't enough to solidify his hands so he could defend if he needed to. Midoriya. All three kids turned around, even though only one had their name called. Aizawa towered over them, his hands stuffed into his pockets. His long, black hair brushed over his tired eyes, but he still managed to look intimidating. The teacher continued when no one responded. I need to speak to you. The teen flashed a worried look to Uraraka, and she shared the same sentiment. Ada stiffened up and straightened out his glasses. The girl was the first to speak, surprisingly. It's okay, Midori, she assured. We'll see you tomorrow. Ah, okay, he mumbled. His two new friends sent him bright smiles and waved as they exited the classroom. Midoriya smiled back, though it wasn't as wide. He turned around to face his teacher, but kept his guard up, not knowing what to expect. Gami's tall figure loomed next to him and made him feel safer. That was one of the nicest aspects about having the Spectre around pretty much 24/7. He never felt alone, no matter the situation. The spirit already did a lot to reassure him on a daily basis, but his presence alone simply put him at ease. What did you need, Aizawa-sensei? He pondered. It's about the Quirk apprehension test, he answered, but not here. That made the teen pale. He hoped his teacher wasn't getting suspicious about his quirk. That would definitely not end well. The hero walked to the door and gestured for the boy to follow him. He was growing more nervous by the second, but he did his best to hide it so as to not draw attention. He twiddled his gloved fingers together and stepped through the doorway, but stopped to check the classroom. There were only a few students left in the corners of the room, and Midoriya didn't know any of their names. But his eyes settled on the one student he did know, one red and white-haired boy. He felt bad that he wouldn't be able to hold out on his promise, but there wasn't anything he could really do. Todoroki just stared back without a word, and the tension in the room only strengthened. The shy teen just sent him an awkward smile and a slight wave, before rushing off to catch up to Aizawa. The duo walked slightly behind the teacher as he led them down another hall. The ghost and boy shared a lot of looks between each other, with Gami making comments every here and there. Do not worry too much. I am sure it will all work out. He didn't answer, of course, so the ghost just kept rambling. Besides, we rehearsed what to say to most typical questions concerning your quirk. They turned down another hallway. Midoriya was still unsure of where they were going, or what exactly Aizawa needed with him. Whatever it may be, we are most likely overthinking it. He could only focus on the soft echoes of his footsteps behind the hero, and the smooth tone of his mentor's voice. Maybe he is simply curious about. We're here, the pro unknowingly interrupted. The teen looked out from behind his teacher, but a seemingly normal door was the only thing that greeted him. Though the door looked similar to most of the closets and rooms in the school, something about it seemed so imposing. He clasped his hands nervously and held them close to his chest, his fingers twitching. He couldn't deny the fact that he admired Eraserhead. The man was one of his biggest inspirations growing up, especially after meeting All Might. The way he fought, his nonchalant attitude, his whole stature, made him Midoriya's favorite hero. The hero just put the boy's mind into overdrive. Even his companion admitted that he was interesting, and Gami found few things appealing. But right now, he was feeling less awe and more afraid. The pro was radiating this serious energy and it just infected the air around them. It felt like something was caught in his throat. Aizawa turned the handle and swung open the door. It creaked on its hinges for a second, but didn't make a sound afterwards. The teacher didn't walk it right away though, just held it open. When the student didn't move, his eyes snapped down and he moved out his hand. "Go on in," he clarified. The teen jumped. Oh, okay. He did what the hero said, and walked inside. The room looked to be an office, with wide windows covering the back wall. There was simply furnishing, a large wooden desk and a seating area in front of it. Behind the desk was a tall swivel chair facing the windows. The chair was moving, so he could tell that someone was in it. The door was shut behind him, and drew a startled gasp from him. He spun around to see the hero closing the door. The man gestured to take a seat, so Midoriya did. He carefully sat down on one end of the small couch, and Aizawa placed himself on the other end. The boy nudged his form closer to the armrest, hoping to increase the space between them. Gami stood next to his successor by the couch and rested his hand near the armrest. He tried to lean on it, but his hand slipped right through. Normally, he would have at least snorted at that, but he had enough self-control and common sense to realize that may not be a good idea when in close proximity to a pro hero. Then, the office chair turned around, shocking the teen out of his bewilderment. At first, he saw no one sitting and the possibility of a ghost ran through his head. But then, a small animal hoisted himself off of the seat and onto the desk. The duo observed him silently. They both weren't sure what animal he was, but he wore a black suit with orange sneakers. The shoes were very similar to Midoriya's own, the thick soles matching up and everything. The rodent-looking creature reached the edge of his desk and sat down, letting his feet dangle off. He smiled at the two sitting in front of him before saying his signature greeting. "Am I a dog, a mouse, a bear? Who knows?" the animal declared. "But more importantly, I'm the principal." The boy paled. He was in front of the principal. Aizawa had taken him to the principal. He couldn't shake the feeling out of his gut that this wasn't going to be good. Hello sir," he stuttered out. "You can just refer to me as Nezu, Midoriya," he stated. "Would you care for a cup of tea?" His hands grew clammy. It was just his luck that the principal knew his name. That meant he was probably looking into him. "Sure, Nezu-san." The principal hopped off his desk and headed over to a small table by a bookshelf. While there, he opened up what looked to be a thermos and poured its contents into 2 cups. "I'm assuming you don't want any, Aizawa-san?" he asked. "No, I'm good. Thanks though." The animal then returned with 2 cups in his hand. He placed one on the coffee table in front of the couch and pushed it towards the teen. He slowly picked it up with both gloved hands, feeling the warmth even through the polyester. He took a small sip and instantly felt at ease. The principal sat down back on the desk, his tail swing back and forth. "Do you know why you're here, Midoriya?" he began, still holding the cup between his paws. "Just stay calm." "No sir." Nezu then gestured to the other pro. Aizawa coughed to clear his throat. "During the Quirk apprehension test, I asked you to demonstrate the throw for everyone, yes?" the tired man questioned. Midoriya resisted the urge to look at Gami for guidance. He kept both hands on the teacup and looked over to his homeroom teacher. "Yeah, you did," he confirmed. There was a short pause before the man continued. "I understand you know of me." The teen brightened at that. "Yeah, you're Eraserhead. If this is about me calling you out in front of everyone, then I just want to apologize and that I totally didn't mean to." The pro held out his hand, and he immediately stopped rambling. "That's not what this is about. You know what my quirk is." Where was the hero going with this? "Why yeah, it's erasure. You can erase people's quirks when you look at them, unless they're mutant types. Your quirk is classified as an emitter, correct?" The man narrowed his eyes. That was what Midoriya listed his quirk as. It seemed like the best fit. "Yes, then do you want to explain why I couldn't erase your quirk during the test?" The gasp lodged itself in the boy's throat. This was certainly unexpected. He turned to glare at the spirit, but caught himself midway and snapped his head back. What was he supposed to do? There was no way he could have expected to have Eraserhead as his homeroom teacher, so he didn't have an excuse prepared for something like this. Nezu and Aizawa were currently staring him down. He had to say something soon, but his mind was racing and drawing a blank at the same time. His heartbeat flooded his ears as his hands grew sweaty. He couldn't even form a coherent thought like this, much less a believable lie. You could spin it as a misunderstanding. Make them believe your powers are what is it called? A mutant quirk instead. This time, the teen couldn't stop himself from snapping to his mentor. He knew the man was only trying to help, but this wasn't really helping. "That's not how it works," he seethed. But unfortunately, his angry whisper wasn't quiet enough to be completely unheard. At least, not to the individual in the room who had sharper senses. "Who are you talking to, Midoriya?" Nezu inquired with a curious, yet sadistic smile. If Aizawa's declaration didn't make him PSS himself, the principal's statement certainly did. Eraserhead turned to look at his student. He definitely wasn't expecting this kind of turnout. His gut was starting to push the idea that this kid could be a spy, and had some sort of communications device on him right now. He reached for his phone, and was ready to call Tsukachi and some other heroes if it came to that. Midoriya's throat grew dry. He was really at a loss for what to do. Gami could see the bind his successor was in. The truth about his powers and subsequently the explanation of being death wasn't some sort of secret that needed to be kept. There were no repercussions from the higher-ups if the current death spilled to someone. It was more of putting oneself at risk. After all, outing a fact like that could lead his friend to be targeted or experimented on, or even locked away. The Spectre wished he had this conversation with the boy before this. "Your position isn't something that is required to be kept secret," he tried to explain quickly, cursing out his luck. "You will not get punished if you spill. However, you will be putting yourself at risk." Well, at this point, the teen could see really no other way out of this situation. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," he finally responded to the principal. Aizawa tensed. The rodent smirked even wider. "Try me." The boy swallowed thickly. "Here goes nothing." "Well, there's a ghost next to me." He could see the looks of disbelief on the teachers' faces. There was no stopping now. "He's a bit over 5 centuries old, and he's basically my mentor. I don't know his real name though, so I just call him Gami." His homeroom teacher still looked skeptical, but Nezu just seemed interested. "All right then. Assuming what you are saying is the truth, what does Gami have to do with your quirk?" And here was the waterfall. He held his breath, preparing to go over. "I don't actually have a quirk. Gami passed his powers down to me." That was the simplest way of saying it. After quite a while in the principal's office, Midoriya was able to explain everything. And by everything, I mean everything. How he was the current death, and Gami was the previous. How he handled his position and what exactly that entailed. How his powers didn't stem from a quirk factor and the mass amount of other abilities he actually had. And how the ghost had been with him since he was little, helping him through his first 11 years. The teen wasn't sure how the teachers had remained so level-headed during the whole time. He was sure his story and claims sounded outlandish. If he was hearing them for the first time, he wasn't sure that he himself would believe them. But Nezu and Aizawa simply let him talk without any interruptions. After he was done explaining, the principal wanted to see his abilities for himself. So the boy disintegrated a few sheets of paper all while Eraserhead used his quirk on him. And just like the quirk apprehension test, he was unaffected. "So Gami-san is basically the Grim Reaper?" Nezu questioned. Said Spirit growled. "I am not whatever you consider the Grim Reaper." "He's not too happy at being called that," Midoriya referred, "but basically." "Excuse me, I just said I was not." The rodent continued, "But he retired from his duties after a few centuries." "Indeed," the teen confirmed. "And because he is no longer active, his position is now yours." "Yes," Nezu hummed. "Well, I see no reason to not believe you." At that, the teen's eyes popped out of his skull. "Wait, really? You believe me? As unbelievable as your story may seem, there really is no reason for you to have such a bizarre explanation unless it were true." The student let out a huge sigh of relief. "Oh, thank God." The principal continued, "As for your quirk records, it is best to leave them as is for your safety. If you truly do have immortality, then keeping that a secret from villains is ideal. Though, I do want to keep a separate record of your abilities." "That's understandable," he nodded. "However, I won't keep you any longer today. Your first day has likely been hectic enough. I'll be having you back in my office for further evaluations, though." Midoriya was shocked at what he was implying. "Wait, so you're not kicking me out of UA?" Nezu chuckled. "Why would I do that?" "I mean, because of the whole lying on my quirk records thing." "Nonsense," he exclaimed. "Besides, your situation is most intriguing. I'd prefer to keep tabs on you here at UA." Gami gave the rodent a suspicious look. He wasn't going to let this individual do anything invasive or dangerous to his successor. He wanted to make sure both teachers remembered that he was here, watching them. He was still a force to be reckoned with. Goddamn, if they even laid a hand on him, he would make sure they felt his fury. In the spirit's protective rage, he impulsively swiped at the principal. His hand was off by a few inches though, and plowed towards the teacup he had set down on the table. He wasn't expecting to interact with anything, but the universe had other plans. Midoriya watched in horror as Gami knocked over Nezu's teacup. The cup clattered on the table and the leftover tea spilled over the side. "Gami, what's gotten into you?" he cried. "Oh, Nezu-san, I'm so sorry." "It's quite all right," he replied, but looked over to the spot by the couch in curiosity. The teen also looked there with a disapproving stare. I do not want my presence to be forgotten. If they do anything to you, I will do all that I can to fight back, the ghost clarified. So he repeated what his mentor said, sorry again. Gami doesn't want you all to forget that he's here. He's a bit protective of me. A bit was an understatement, but the principal took no offense. Oh well, Gami-san, I can assure you I will not harm Midoriya, nor intentionally put him in harm's way. The specter seemed satisfied at that and the tension in the room died down. Nezu dismissed them and moved to clean up his spilled tea. Aizawa held open the door again for the student, and the two, plus the ghost, walked back down the hallway. Not a word was spoken, but the silence ate away at the boy's conscience. Do you believe me? He mumbled. Aizawa-sensei. The teacher looked down. Well, if Nezu does, then I don't really have a reason not to, even if your story seems a bit too outlandish to be rational. Oh, they continued to walk, with more silence creeping up behind them. He hoped he hadn't made the pro upset in any way. Aizawa never thought he was good with kids, but after years of living with Hisashi, he got good at picking up emotions. Look, problem child, he started. I'm not mad or anything, if that's what you think. Oh, they turned down a hall, and Midoriya could see the one classroom. He fiddled with his gloved fingers nervously. Despite finishing his tea, he could feel his throat dry up again. Aizawa-sensei, the teen began. The hero looked over to him again, but didn't say anything. He just took it as a motion to continue. I'm not sure how much you caught back in the office, but my decay is permanent when used on a living organism. The tired teacher raised an eyebrow. Yeah, I heard that. The timid boy kept on. Well, I'm a bit afraid of it. Aizawa immediately caught on to what he was trying to say. The kid was training at a hero school, so eventually he'd have to fight villains. Having such a dangerous power like that would make anyone second guess using it on a person, even if it is in self-defense. Problem child, if I see you hesitating, I'll let you know whether or not to use it. Call it permission if you will. Midoriya smiled. I'd appreciate that. They eventually stopped at the classroom door and parted ways. Eraserhead went back inside to finish up his paperwork, and the student left for the exit. He had spent nearly 2 hours in Nezu's office. If his mother cared about him, she'd be frantic to know why he was so late. But he knew she really didn't, so the time difference was of no worry to him. Well, that went surprisingly well. I know, he agreed and pushed open the front doors. The duo walked together down the appealing path, trying to collect themselves. Today had definitely been a crazy day. Between finding out that Bakugo was in his class, to the Quirk apprehension test, to the possibility of making real friends, and now outing his biggest secret to Eraserhead and Nezu, the teen was looking forward to just going home and doing nothing. Maybe he'd take a long shower and lounge out on the couch. That sounded nice right about now. But right as he exited the front gates of the school, all thoughts of relaxation were blown from his head. GIHH, he cried out in shock. The object that had startled him wasn't even an object at all. It was a familiar candy cane-headed boy leaning against the gate. At the cry, Todoroki stood up straight again and walked over to Midoriya. Todoroki, I wasn't expecting to see you. He stuttered. We did agree to talk after school, the student replied bluntly. Why yeah, but it's been nearly 2 hours. The green-haired boy was a little freaked out at his dedication, but the other kids simply shrugged nonchalantly. Gami wasn't sure what to make of the situation, but after all that had happened today, he was ready to defend any way he could. When Todoroki didn't start the conversation, Midoriya tried to. The awkward silence was really making him uncomfortable. So, what did you want to talk about? My father is the hero Endeavor. I'm sure you must have heard of him. Well, that was certainly one way to start a conversation. Though, that did explain why his family name felt so familiar. Yeah, the teen responded carefully. He's the number 2 hero. Todoroki huffed in confirmation. My old man is ambitious. He aims for the top. He could see where the teen in front of him was coming from. Endeavor had always been a bit rash and hasty in his hero work after all. That must have been due to his ambitious nature. But he didn't bother to interrupt and let him keep talking. He used his power in order to make a name for himself as a hero, but he was never able to best All Might. The symbol of peace is living proof of his failure. Midoriya stiffened at the wording. Todoroki was being oddly harsh towards his father. Sure, he didn't really fancy the number 2 hero either, but still, this seemed kind of rough coming from his own son. He's still at it though, trying to take down All Might, one way or another. I'm not really sure what you're getting at. He was desperate for some clarification, and he could tell his mentor was thoroughly confused as well. What are you trying to tell me, Todoroki? Have you ever heard of Quirk marriages? What? The ghost growled. He hadn't heard of them, but based on the spirit's reaction, he could tell they were nothing good. They became a problem in the first few generations after superpowers became widespread. There were those who sought out potential mates solely with the intention of creating powerful children. The stoic student paused. Many people were forced into relationships. They were simply viewed as old-fashioned arranged marriages, but clearly it was unethical. Do not tell me. My father had not only a rich history of accomplishments, but plenty of money to throw at his problems. Midoriya could see where this was going, but he hoped desperately for his thoughts to be wrong. He bought my mother's relatives to get his hands on her quirk, and now he's raising me to usurp all might. The shy teen couldn't hold back the pain gasp that escaped his throat. How despicable. The majority of humans today have no respect for one another. But Todoroki either didn't notice or didn't care. In every memory of my mother, I only see her cry. Midoriya brought his hands to his mouth, but couldn't stop the stray tears from falling. It hurt to hear his classmate recount such a horrible childhood. His heart panged as he recalled his own nightmares from when he was younger. I remember she called my left side unbearable. He continued, despite the reaction from the boy he was speaking to, before she poured boiling water on my face. He caught the sob that he nearly released after hearing that. His thoughts now centered on his own burn scar that laid across his chest. Todoroki was still just a child. He himself was still just a child. What had any of them done to deserve such a fate? Even though my mother was the one who gave me this scar, he gestured to his right eye. I only blame my scumbag of a father for pushing her to this. Why? He stumbled. Why are you telling me all this? The candy cane boy took a step closer. I saw the same pain in your eyes from the moment you walked into the classroom. You've gone through the same as I have. The currently distraught teen looked up shakily. What? I thought that your parents might have been pro-heroes, but I don't think that anymore. But that doesn't dismiss the fact I still believe you are different from everyone else. Different? He knew Todoroki was probably referring to his home life or something. But what should he even say? His classmate had just spilled his whole tragic backstory to him, and yet he was hesitant to do the same. You do not have to say anything. Gami could probably see his dilemma, but still, the advice didn't feel right to take. The two boys waited in silence, but the minute he looked back up into Todoroki's eyes, guilt flooded his conscience. My father was always distant. His mouth had started for him. He worked abroad and was never usually home, so it was only my mother and I when I got my quirk diagnosed. He watched as the red and white-haired boy listened intently. He didn't want to lie, but he also couldn't spill everything, so he treaded lightly around the truth. I was an outlier compared to my parents. That wasn't technically a lie after all. His quirklessness didn't run in the family. My mother was quiet about it at first, but when my father found out, he wasn't happy. Gami was impressed that his successor was managing to recount this horrific event so calmly. His friend had told no one about his situation at home, and yet this boy had coaxed it out of him. The days after my diagnosis, my parents constantly fought. My father didn't want me anymore, and my mother was at a loss for what to do. Midoriya tugged at his uniform collar, revealing the bit of his scar that peeked out. He heard Todoroki take a sharp inhale. On the third day after, my parents got into a really bad fight and he hit her. I tried to help her and calm him down, but my father was too furious. He has a fire-breathing quirk. That definitely made Todoroki gasp, though it was small and light. He burned me that night, all across my chest and right shoulder. The teen motioned to his chest where the scar laid. He never came back after that night either. The other boy tried to respond. My mother, he didn't mean to interrupt, but if he stopped now, he was afraid he wouldn't start again. She blames me for his departure. She resorted to alcohol to try and cope, but things only got worse. I don't have anywhere else to go though, so I just try and stay out of her way. He took a slow breath once he finished, and Todoroki's cold gaze softened. I'm sorry, he began, that you went through that. I'm sorry for you too. I had no idea Endeavor was so cruel. Most people don't. He's got enough money to cover anything up anyway, so it's not like I could say anything. They stayed quiet for a while. Midoriya picked at his gloves while Todoroki shuffled his hands in his pockets. Gami moved his arms to wrap around the small boy, hoping to comfort him. He had no idea what was going to come of this conversation. But he didn't want to see someone so similar to him struggle on his own, like he was. So he took a risk that he hoped wouldn't backfire on him. I'm still not too sure what you were trying to accomplish with this conversation. But do you want to be friends? We can work through this together. Todoroki's eyes narrowed. I didn't come here to make friends. He paled. Oh. The timid boy's reaction immediately made him feel guilty for some odd, unfamiliar reason. So he tried to save face. But I wouldn't mind making an exception, Midoriya. When said child flinched, he realized his mistake. Sorry, I forgot what you said about the name in the locker room. Though now I can understand why. It's fine. You can call me by a nickname. The candy cane teen shuffled. I'm not very good with coming up with nicknames. Midoriya hummed. Well, some people are calling me Midori. But if that's not your style, you can use my given. I'm afraid I don't know it. It's Izuku. Todoroki nodded. Then I'll use that. If you could extend the same courtesy to me, I'd rather not go under that scumbag's name. Do you have a preference? He asked, ignoring the quip. You can use my given as well, the student clarified. He already knew what the green-haired teen was going to ask. It's Shadow. He flashed the stoic kid a wide smile and gripped his backpack straps. Gami proudly stood behind his successor, excited he was taking the initiative to make a friend. So, friends, Shouto, friends, Izuku. Midoriya didn't get very much sleep that night, his mind still locked onto what Todoroki had shared with him. He felt somewhat guilty for trying to end the conversation earlier in the locker room, but also thankful the other student had been so persistent. Gami had told him not to think about it for too long, and to try and get some rest. After all, it was merely the end of the first day. Tomorrow would surely be the start of new chaos. The next day, he woke up early as he normally did, surrounded by an appealing array of flowers and plants. He would have never guessed that taking care of the spider lilies his middle school classmates left for him would have led to a green thumb. But it did, and gardening soon became a new, relaxing hobby for the boy. Of course, it was a delicate challenge. He had to garden with his gloves on, since the plants would wilt otherwise, and he SC'd together the extra cash to upgrade from used mason jars and water to small flower pots and soil. He'd also strayed away from his roots, no pun intended. The teen had started out with taking care of the lilies he had received, but now he didn't grow as many flowers. Most types simply grew too tall for him to manage with gloves. He ended up taking a gamble on some dying succulents one store was giving away, but after a few days of intense care, they thrived and bloomed. The way those little plants grew was so rapid, he had needed to bring out the old mason jars just to give them more space. Succulents ended up becoming his favorite plant to garden, since they spread so quickly and were so resilient. His shelves were covered in them. Midoriya found it ironic for an individual like himself to be surrounded by so much life. He watched as Gami drew open the curtains, letting the morning sun peek through and shower him. The spirit had gotten much better at accurately interacting with his curtains, so that was definitely a plus. It was kind of like his everyday chore he liked to help out with. Opening up his bedroom door, Midoriya made his way into the kitchen. He was fully dressed and held his backpack by the straps. He scoured the cabinet for something to bring along with him for the subway ride, eyes landing on an old granola bar. He could feel his stomach shudder, but it would have to do until he could go grocery shopping again. The duo left the house and strolled down to the subway station. They were a few minutes early, so the boy plopped himself down onto one of the waiting benches. "What do you think you will do in heroics today?" the man asked, hoping to start some sort of conversation to kill the silence. He shrugged subtly, but when most of the subway goers cleared out of the area, he replied, "I'm not sure. Hopefully nothing too stressful like yesterday." He was actually hoping for some bookwork in class. Maybe they'd study hero and villain philosophy, or go over basic Quirk laws and regulations. Yesterday caused him to sweat so much, he might as well have Bakugo's Quirk. He felt his throat go dry. Maybe that old granola bar wasn't the best thing to have eaten so early in the morning. His hands grew shaky and he started to feel sick. But as his head began to spin, he started to think this wasn't because of the granola bar. Clutching his head, he groaned in discomfort. The ghost flew into action and gave the teen an anchor. A familiar buzzing flooded his ears as he was thrown into a swirling mess of colors and shapes, as many as he had and would have in the future. Midoriya would never get used to the feeling of being SCK into a premonition. The subway station quickly changed into what the boy assumed to be an office building of some sort. He took in his surroundings. Currently, the room he was in had concrete pillars that stretched to the ceilings and evenly tiled flooring. He could make out large windows on every wall. The room was surprisingly empty, without any desks or anything, which made him second-guess his initial assumption of this being an office building. The most obvious thing he could see, though, was a large hole in the floor. It looked to be a wide channel that stretched from left to right, and it had to be over 15 feet wide. He couldn't walk over to it, as these visions normally had him stand in one spot, but he guessed it led to the floor below. Then he heard footsteps behind him. The boy turned to look away from the doorway. He could make out two figures walking towards him, or at least, towards the exit door. And as they got closer, he paled at who they turned out to be. He watched Ada and Uraraka stop a few feet away from the canyon in the floor, idly chatting about something he couldn't make out. They were wearing odd clothing, Ada in something similar to a suit of armor, and Uraraka decked out in pink, space-like gear. He swung his head around in a panicked manner, searching to catch what would happen to them. A loud explosion rocked his world. He couldn't see where it came from, but the blast shot past him, tossing his hair all about. Hearing the brunette cry out, he lurched over in that direction. He could barely make out their forms, but watched in horror as they were thrown from their feet and over the edge of the gap, likely to their demise a floor below. The crippling feeling of his spine shattering only confirmed that for the teen. The agonizing taste of death finally released him from the vision. The scene returned to being just a subway station, and he focused on his companion squeezing his hands. He couldn't tell if the man was saying something, his ears still ringing from the blast. It felt as if someone had knocked him right in the head, and the phantom pains in his spine throbbed. "Izu, if you can hear me." He could finally make out what the specter was saying. "Tell me 3 things you can see." Midoriya looked around hazily. He could make out another blue bench a few steps away, as well as a directory behind it. There's a bench over there. It's blue. A subway map is behind it. He groggily searched for something else, and a passing train. Oh, thank God, Gami replied. 2 things you can feel. The student flexed his fingers damnately, still reasonably dazed. The metal bench. It's rusty. It was difficult to really feel things with gloves on though. And my uniform breathe. And 1 thing you can hear. Just the passing trains. They're really loud today. The teen felt himself calm down as the man in front of him sighed in relief. Are you back? He smiled tiredly. Yeah, I'm right here. You were mumbling a lot this time. I just got worried. Do you want to tell me what happened? He gulped heavily. I saw Uraraka and Ida. He didn't get any reaction from Gami, from lunch. Yes, I remember. I have not forgotten yet, he said with a snarky undertone. Midoriya ignored it. I don't know where they were, but there was a big explosion and they fell. His fingers snaked behind his neck and ghosted over the start of his spine. The ghost got the idea. The boy quivered. It hurt so much this time. His voice was quiet, like a scared child. The man threaded a few fingers into his successor's hair. I can only imagine. But you can help them. These pep talks never got any easier. Gami wished he could take some parental classes for the undead or something. The teen nodded shakily, unsure of himself. I can help them. Exactly, he reassured. Now how about we board the subway before it leaves without us? He got up unsteadily, but with his mentor's assistance, he managed to stand on his feet. With slow steps, he made his way into the train and threw his shaky body into another seat. Dropping his bag on the seat next to him, he picked at his gloves and stared as the train doors closed. With a sudden lurch, the subway started moving, its creaky wheels unable to drown out his overwhelming thoughts. Why couldn't he have a normal morning today? So far, the day had been reasonably uneventful. Gami and Midoriya didn't talk as much as they did in the past, but managed to sneak some short comments back and forth. They were currently in English class with present Mike, and the teacher was trying to stir up some spirit in the students. So listeners, he exclaimed, which one of the following English sentences is incorrect? No one in the class bothered to answer. The teen looked around at his classmates. They all just stared blankly towards the front of the room, seemingly bored. All right, everybody, hands up, show me some spirit. Midoriya knew the answer to the question. He was fairly decent in his English studies, but that didn't mean he wanted to volunteer to respond. He was sure there were other students who knew as well, so someone would answer eventually. So, do you plan on telling Aizawa and Nezu about your foresight this morning? They are students here after all. Yeah, I will, he whispered lightly. I'm going to do it after heroics. That's the best time anyway. How about you, Midoriya? The pro called out. Do you know the answer? Said boy paled in shock. Of course the teacher had decided to call on him. It was plausible the man heard him mumbling, but that still didn't make him all right with being singled out. Take a deep breath, his mentor directed. You know the answer. So he did. Collecting himself with a breath, he managed to get his nerves under control. It's number 4. Present Mike pressed on. Can you explain why? He nearly growled. He knew that the hero was only doing his job, but did he really have to make him explain? The R relative conjunction is in the wrong place. That's correct, the man announced like he was on a game show. Now for the next. The lunch bell suddenly rang, and all of the students quickly rushed out. Midoriya sighed gratefully and collected his things. He was ready for a break, and lunch would be exactly that. The boy piled up his books into his bag just as Uraraka and Ida approached him. Hey, Midori, ready for lunch? She asked cheerfully. Oh, Uraraka, his mind betrayed him and returned to that horrific scene this morning. Why yeah, I'm pretty hungry. The 3 kids left the classroom in a hurry and joined the lunch line. As inexpensive as the school's food was, the teen wasn't sure if he'd be able to eat it for each day. His pockets were already running thin and he needed to shop for food at home. He wasn't actually planning on eating today, but since the 2 students practically dragged him onto the line, he figured he'd indulge himself. He bought himself a hot plate of white rice and steamed vegetables and sat down with his friends. So heroics is our last class of the day, the brunette stated. What do you guys think we'll do? I don't know, Ida replied. I assumed it wouldn't be anything strenuous at first, but with Aizawa-sensei as our homeroom teacher, I am no longer so sure of myself. Midoriya hummed in agreement, his mouth full of savory food. What about you, Midori? What do you think? At first, he had hoped for some simple bookwork, but after his vision, he desperately hoped for nothing that would put them in danger. I just hope it's nothing too crazy. Uraraka agreed with him. Yeah, hopefully no threats of expulsion like yesterday. The 3 then continued to chat calmly, and made sure to balance out their time with eating as well. The time flew by and they eventually cleaned up their table. The quiet boy searched for signs of his other new friend, but Todoroki was nowhere to be found. That had left him slightly disappointed, but he didn't let it show. The 3 of them left the lunchroom and walked back together to their classroom. Midoriya sat down at his desk towards the back of the classroom and smiled at Uraraka and Ida, who did the same. Eventually, the rest of the students filed in, and soon enough, everyone was waiting on a teacher to arrive. Last chance to change your guess, Gami teased. I still think it is going to be a lesson on damage protocol after a villain attack. He scoffed quietly, whatever you saw. But the boy didn't get to finish as the classroom door swung open, and walked a person both had forgotten was working at UA. The two both flinched at the voice, though only one was truly visible, coming through the door like a normal person. The last time Midoriya had seen All Might was during the holographic projection that had told him of his acceptance to UA. He had been shocked that the hero was going to be teaching at the school, but forgot about it in the months between. And while he couldn't bring himself to hate the number one hero, his presence definitely made him uncomfortable. He fiddled with his gloves nervously as he felt the spirit move closer to him protectively. The teen tried not to show his discomfort as the class gasped in awe. It's All Might. Incredible. He's really gonna teach us. That's his Silver Age costume. Look at him go. Midoriya stayed quiet, but across the classroom, one red and white-haired teen noticed him shuffle in his seat. His heterochromatic eyes fell-seekered from his new friend to the number one hero in the room. Hero basic training. The pro started loudly. The class that'll put you through all sorts of special training to mold you into heroes. The duo grew worried. The odds of having a calm, last class of the day was growing slimmer by the minute. No time to dally. Today's activity is this. He held up a card with bold lettering on it, battle training. And there went any chance at a nice afternoon. He had been unfortunately placed right behind Bakugo in the seating chart, but watched the blonde grow more and more eerily excited at that prospect. That unnerved him, but he took a breath and just continued listening. And for that, you'll need these. Suddenly, the classroom walls shifted and extended. Massive shelving units broke from the wall, each containing a number from 1 to 20. Midoriya realized they likely corresponded with each student in the class, in accordance with the Quirk registry and the special request forms you filled out before being admitted. The class understood where All Might was going with this. Costumes. Yeah, this is awesome. Oh, I'm so excited. The seasoned hero couldn't get the students to quiet down, so he simply yelled over them. After you change, come out in ranking order to ground beta. Everyone responded back in loud agreements before rushing over to grab their briefcase with their costume in it. Gami watched as his successor waited for the pile-up to die down before walking over to grab his own. Together, they made their way to the locker room in order to change. Do not be too worried about anything. I am sure all will turn out well. The boy huffed indifferently. That's what you said yesterday, and looked at what happened. The ghost rolled his eyes, but the child couldn't tell. Midoriya changed in the stall as he did yesterday and rushed out to the grounds as the hero stated. He was fully dressed in his hero costume that he and Gami had spent numerous hours designing. Together they came up with a costume that the teen really felt comfortable with. Midori. He heard Uraraka cry out, cool costume. Really practical looking. He flushed and grew embarrassed. His costume design was something he was proud of, but hearing it from someone else really made him feel good. The body of his costume was a black jumpsuit, similar to a Eraserhead, but a bit more skin-tight and reached all the way to his wrists and ankles. He wore a short, brown cape that wrapped around and clipped together in the front. The cape only reached his elbows, but that was purposely designed so it was harder to be grabbed by a villain. He also had a pair of brown combat boots, which had thick, iron soles. The boy wanted his costume to resemble more of a Reaper style, since that was what his quirk was named, but realized a look like that would be inconvenient for fighting and would probably scare civilians off. So the duo quickly modified their designs to fit more of a steampunk look, with solid combinations of brown and black. His costume had a few changes unlike his original design. The support team who designed it added iron heels and tips to his boots, which he was grateful for, as well as metal knee pads. But they also took his steampunk theme a bit farther than the duo had planned, and added numerous LTHR straps and belt buckles to the jumpsuit, and a pair of geared clocks to the sides of his shoes. And while the extra parts didn't interfere with the costume's practicality, he wasn't quite sure how to feel about them. But all in all, wearing the suit felt just like his own skin. Combined with his usual gloves, Midoriya was ready to take on whatever All Might had planned. He turned around to face Uraraka and nearly fainted in shock. Her suit was the same gear he saw her in during his premonition that morning. It was the same pink space gear he remembered, but he calmed himself down enough to respond. Gee, thanks, Uraraka. Why, yours is neat too. She smiled warmly. I wish I'd been more specific on my request form though. The suit's really skin tight. He tried to get his brain back into analysis mode. Anything to get away from the pressing thoughts of his vision. Well, your quirk makes you nauseous, right? Oh, yeah, she confirmed, remembering the entrance exam where she threw up right in front of him. Then it's probably to cradle your pressure points, he continued at her confused look, to make you less nauseous. The brunette laughed. Oh, well, I guess that makes more sense. Midoriya looked around in search of Ida, but couldn't really pick him out of the crowd. though. After a second look, he spotted a familiar suit of white armor and nearly threw up. Gami watched his successor grow distraught and added in his 2 cents. Izu, he began, just keep an eye on them. Remember that just because the pieces are lining up now, does not mean the puzzle will be completed today. He grimly nodded and tugged at his costume. Breathe. He just needed to look out for them. There was no way he'd let anything happen to his friends on his watch, looking to take his mind off of Uraraka and Ida's possible demise. He spotted a familiar head of candy cane hair. Well, it was more like just white hair, as half of Todoroki's body was covered in ice. He rushed over to talk. Hey, to the boy corrected himself quietly. Shouto. Hello Izuku, the stoic student replied back. Your costume looks good. He grew bashful. Aw, thanks. I actually came over to ask about yours. Oh, Todoroki pondered. I'm not sure you ever explained your quirk to me, Midoriya rambled. But what's with all the ice? The boy shifted and grew more serious. My quirk is half cold, half hot. It lets me generate ice from my right side and fire from my left. But your whole left side is frozen over. I refuse to use my BSDRD of a father's quirk, he stated bluntly. I'll become a hero without it. But Shouto. The reserve team never got to finish as All Might called out. It's time for battle training. Most of the students cheered, with the exception being himself since he was still in shock, Todoroki, Bakugo, and a few others. Ida then stepped up towards the front of the crowd, making Midoriya realize how far back he was. Sensei. This appears to be the same field used in the entrance exam. Will we once again be performing sit-escape maneuvers? All Might shook his head. No. You will be moving on to step 2. Indoor anti-personnel battle training. The hero grew more animated as he spoke. Villain battles are most commonly seen outdoors, but statistically, the most heinous villains are more likely to appear indoors. He raised a hand to his mouth in contemplation. The teen and his companion studied him closely. The pro was making strange pauses in his statements, almost like he was unsure of what to say. Between confinement, house arrest, and black market deals. In this hero society of ours, All Might took a break to cough. The cleverest villains out there lurk indoors. Well, he couldn't disagree with that, at the very least. His mind went back to the sludge villain incident. While the villain was indeed strong, he wasn't too bright. If attacking Bakugo in the middle of a shopping district was saying something. You'll now be split into villain teams and hero teams, and face off in 2-on-2 indoor battles. The frog girl Midoriya recognized from the quirk test spoke up, so no basic training. The pro seemed to grow defensive. Practical experience teaches you the basics. The distinction here is that you won't be fighting disposable robots. At that, the class devolved into wild comments. What determines victory? Probed a spiky black-haired girl who he recognized to be Yaoyorozu from the quirk test as well. Can I just blast everyone away? Bakugo growled. Are you threatening to expel someone like Aizawa-sensei did? Uraraka timidly asked. How do we proceed to divide ourselves into teams? Ida questioned stiffly. How fabulous is my cape? Shined one blonde boy he didn't know the name of. All Might became even more frustrated, one at a time. My quirk isn't super hearing. He quickly composed himself and opened up a tiny pamphlet from his back pocket. Both Midoriya and Gami deadpanned. The hero was reading from a guide that explained his choppy behavior. Listen closely. The villains will be hiding a nuclear weapon in the hideout, and the heroes have to go in and take care of it. The seasoned hero flipped a page. The heroes have a limited amount of time to either capture the villains or secure the weapon. The villains must either capture the heroes or protect the weapon until the time is up. All Might reached for a small box labeled lots and displayed it to the students. Your battle partners will be decided by drawing lots. Ada immediately countered. Is that really the best way? Midoriya pondered the thought. Well, it makes sense. Pros often have to team up with heroes from other agencies on the spot during emergencies. The teen shuddered and looked up, only to find all the eyes of his classmates on him. He must have said that aloud by accident. Ada heard the comment as well and straightened up. I see. I apologize for getting ahead of myself. My mistake. The number 1 hero stiffened up at the sight of the boy, immediately recognizing him from the sludge villain incident. He had gotten to see his performance during the entrance exam and was surprised at his display of a quirk. It made him wonder why the boy had even asked him that question underneath the overpass. But he pushed the thought from his mind and continued with his spiel. It's fine. Let's just get to it. As All Might drew student numbers from the box, Midoriya was afraid the universe would screw with him and pair him up with Bakugo, but he was graced with Uraraka instead, to which he was thoroughly thankful for. He listened as Todoroki was paired with another student who had multiple sets of arms. Ada was the unfortunate one paired with Bakugo, and the boy pitied him. Nice Midori. Must be fate. His partner cheered. Let's do this. He simply smiled back at her and flashed a thumbs up. The hero assigned each team a letter and shuffled them around, moving on. First up are these. He pulled 2 letters out and showed them off. The heroes are Team A. Midoriya and Uraraka looked at each other. They were up first, but who were they going up against? And the villains are Team D. He saw Ida and Bakugo move, and he just knew. Of course the universe decided not to spare him. He was a fool to think it would have mercy on him. All Might didn't notice the hostility he had just created. The villain team goes in first. They have 5 minutes to prepare before the hero team is allowed in. The rest of us will watch via CCTV. He turned to face Ida and Bakugo. You two need to adopt a villain mindset. This is practical experience, so go all out. Don't hold back. That was bad advice to give to a volatile teenager with a dangerous explosion quirk. Though I will stop you if you take things too far. It was too late for the hero to save face now. The two teams separated. The villains entered the building to prepare, while the heroes remained outside to discuss their plans. Ada and Bakugo made their way to the top floor, where they deposited the weapon. The strict boy rapped his knuckles on its side, deeming it paper mache at the noise. He was a bit disappointed at having to play the role of the villains, but didn't let his mood sour his performance. The blonde wasn't as composed as his partner though. He had been angry when he found out that Deku had gotten into UA, but upon seeing the boy display a quirk the other day, he felt his rage peak over and spill. So Deku has a quirk now. Ada caught the comment as well as the teen's attitude. You saw his technique with his weapon? No. He is definitely the bigger threat. Though, I ask you not to charge right at Midoriya. But Bakugo ignored his partner's request. Deku had been fooling him this whole time. And there was no way he'd let the DMN nerd get off like that. Uraraka pulled out the building blueprints that their teacher had given them. The building's blueprints. Better memorize these. Midoriya nodded. He studied the map of the building and came to the scary conclusion that it looked similar to the one he was in during the foresight. His hands started to shake nervously and his partner picked up on that. Are you all right, Midori? You look really worried. Ah, no, it's nothing. He tried to reassure her, but she didn't look convinced. Is it because we're up against Bakugo? Sorta. He didn't technically lie. He was feeling worried about fighting him, so he played it off like that to ease Uraraka's concerns. Well, don't stress too much about it, she replied. We just need to come up with a plan. Gami, who had remained quiet for some time, pitched into the pep talk. Focus on the task at hand. Come up with a plan that keeps both of them safe. Midoriya nodded his head confidently at his mentor's words. He turned to look at the brunette. Well, if a plan is what we need, then I got one. The hero team listened as All Might called in on their intercoms, telling them to start. Midoriya flew into action without hesitation. Gami, he whispered so Uraraka wouldn't hear, find the weapon. Of course, I will report to you once I discover it. The teen watched his ghostly companion float into the building, then turned to his partner. You ready? She nodded. Let's do this. He squatted slightly and motioned for Uraraka to hop on. They had decided that it would be best to enter from one of the higher floors to keep their element of surprise. But having the brunette float both of them up would take a serious toll on her condition. So Midoriya proposed a different solution. Uraraka wrapped her legs around his waist and hung her arms around his neck. Once he felt stable enough to move, the boy made his way to the exterior wall of the building. He placed both hands on the concrete and began to decay it slowly, having removed his gloves once his partner was secure on his back. Once he felt the notches were large enough for his grip, he stopped and prepared to scale the building the same way he had with the zero-pointer. Midori, she started. Are you sure you don't want me to make myself whaleless at least? But he just shook his head. That'll just make you nauseous. Don't worry, I got this. Uraraka didn't want to make her friend doubt himself, so she huffed in agreement. Midoriya hoisted himself up using his first 2 holes, and then gradually made more where he needed them. Sure, the time he scaled the zero-pointer was much easier considering he didn't have another person on him. But even now, they were making their way up the building at a steady pace. The rest of the class observing in the monitor room were having a field day. Wow, look at him go. Is he scaling the building? That's crazy. Todoroki watched quietly, but that didn't mean he wasn't impressed. Scaling a building, especially while carrying someone, was no mere feat. Something like that required great physical strength as well as quirk creativity. It was an ingenious move. Midoriya would definitely be a big contender while he was here at UA. The hero team was currently at the 4th floor when Gami returned. The weapon is being guarded on the 5th floor with Ida. There are no signs of Bakugo anywhere in the building. He hummed, change of plans then. Uraraka heard him. What is it, Midori? Well, the floor above us is the top floor. He tried to explain without mentioning that his ghostly mentor had found the weapon, so that's probably where the weapon is. Ada would probably think that we would float up to the top. She didn't get his point though. If Ada thought we'd start at the top first, why would he put the weapon there? The boy used his head to gesture up at the windows. The 5th floor is covered in big windows. He'd definitely see us coming. Oh, then what do we do? He had already come up with a plan in the time they had been hanging there. Well, if we enter on the 4th floor, we can still keep our element of surprise. Sounds like a plan. Luckily, Midoriya had paused right at one of the 4th floor windows, so he carefully maneuvered himself closer. He was a bit afraid of releasing one of his hands to grab at the window, but he wouldn't let it show. Removing one of his hands from the hole, he touched the window with all 5 fingers and let the DT rush through. Uraraka gasped at the sight of the glass beginning to shatter. Feeling the strain on his one hanging hand, he poured more DT into his fingers and the glass shattered instantly. Thankfully, it broke apart in pieces and wasn't too loud. "Can you reach the window from here?" he asked, returning his hand to the notch for stability. "Yeah, no problem," she whispered excitedly and slipped off his back and through the window hole. He felt the strain leave him once his partner got off his back and into the building. He then threw himself from the wall through the window as well, and landed with a crunch onto the glass pieces. Uraraka did a small, quiet cheer. Successful infiltration. Midoriya nodded. Lots of binds and corners, so watch out. The two then left the window and walked through the building. Both of them had memorized the floor plans fairly well, but what his partner didn't know was that a spirit was currently leading them through the building as well. The ghost scoped out each and every hallway they turned into, making sure he could see that they were safe. He was sure that Bakugo would be coming soon, and he expected either a sneak attack or a blatant rush. Then, as they passed by a small, dead-end hallway, Bakugo's form suddenly jumped out at them. The teen snapped into action and dived to cover his partner. Just as he did, the blonde let a loud explosion out, but thanks to his quick action, the blast only hit the wall. "He barely grazed me," the boy announced. "Are you all right, Uraraka?" "Yeah, thanks," she responded, a bit shaky. "That's good," he confirmed, "but stick to the plan." The brunette nodded and got to her feet. Midoriya jumped to his as the smoke cleared and he could see the blonde. "Nice dodging," Bakugo growled. "Deku." The green-haired teen took a fighting stance. He had told Uraraka earlier that Bakugo would likely go after him, so they incorporated that into their plan. If he fought the raging blonde, he would likely ignore her. She would be able to get away and engage Ida faster than if the two fought Bakugo together. Back at the monitor room, the class grew excited again. "Sneak attacks are so not manly," one red-haired student cried. All Might interjected, "But they are a valid strategy for either heroes or villains." Another pink-skinned girl cried out in awe that Midori sure can dodge. Most of the class agreed with her. Todoroki again observed in silence. He could tell that the blonde was unnaturally hostile towards Midoriya. That made him suspicious. Did the two know each other or something? Bakugo rose to his feet and smiled menacingly, pulling one of his gauntlets back. "I'm gonna mess you up just enough not to be disqualified." He rushed at him with a strong right hook, but the shy boy saw it coming. He rushed forward to close the gap between them and latched both hands onto the gauntlet, making sure to have it secure. He steadied his stance and used Bakugo's own momentum to slam him to the ground. He held onto the gauntlet for a little longer than he needed to, and let the DT flow from his fingertips into it. Bakugo was just in shock. Did Deku just read my moves? Midoriya didn't waste the opportunity. "Uraraka, go." She reacted almost immediately and took off. She didn't want to hesitate and cost her partner the opportunity he had given her. This was all part of their plan after all. The blonde was too angry to care that the girl left the scene. He was ready to bash Deku's face in. "Bakugo, you almost always lead with that right hook," he stated. "I've seen it enough to know." Both boys watched as the right gauntlet flaked away into dust, one in satisfaction and one in rage. "You see, I've analyzed a lot of people in those notebooks of mine," he clarified, "just like the one you blew up and tossed out the window." The blonde took up a squatting position, eyes full of fury. "You spout all that CRP. All while scared out of your mind." He pushed himself back up to his feet. "It PSS me off." Suddenly, Bakugo's comm went off. "Hey Bakugo," out came Ida's voice, "update me on the situation." "What's happening?" He just growled. "Shut up and keep watch. I'm ready to wreck someone." And with that, he cut the line. Bakugo shot himself towards Midoriya with another explosion, ready to ram his knee into the boy. But he saw that coming too and quickly rolled out of the way. Reaching into the pocket that held his gloves, he rummaged around and pulled out a roll of capture tape. He knew it was unlikely that he would actually restrain the blonde, but it might give him an opportunity to attack. He managed to wrap the tape around his leg halfway before Bakugo noticed. He yanked strong on the tape, pulling the blonde off balance. What will come next? If I know Bakugo, he'll rage and attack again. DMNU, Deku, with his usual right hook. The teen dived out of the way as another explosion landed at the spot where he once was. Midoriya didn't want to fight here. The hallway was too narrow for him to pull any stunts with his sai. So during the chaos of that last attack, he quickly turned the corner and ran, knowing Bakugo would follow him. That didn't mean Bakugo liked it though. "Get back here, Deku." He ducked into another hall and stopped just to catch his breath and collect his thoughts. Everything was going more or less according to plan. Bakugo came straight at him, flat out ignoring Uraraka. And based on the calm interaction, there wasn't much teamwork going on between the two on the villain team either. All was working in their favor so far. Now, he would just have to find a way to immobilize or distract Bakugo long enough to get away, so he could help his partner. Uraraka had managed to find the weapon along with Ida, but stayed hidden. She watched her friend mutter to himself and wondered what he was saying. But she had to stay out of sight until Midoriya came back. She listened, and as Ada's mumblings grew louder, Bakugo has a natural tendency towards troublemaking, so this exercise is perfectly suited to him. I suppose I must also take on the role of a villain. He stayed on that tangent. Though it brings shame to the Ida family name, this training will help me become a better man. I must commit. He turned towards the doorway with a menacing look. I am the ultimate evil. The brunette couldn't stop her laughter at that. She let out a loud giggle and alerted the boy of her presence. So you've come, Uraraka, he announced with a dark undertone. I know your quirk allows you to levitate objects you touch, so before you arrived. The armored student spun around a bit and extended his arms in a flashy manner as the girl left her hiding spot. I enacted a counter-strategy against you by removing all objects on this floor. She quickly turned on her comm to get in touch with her partner, Midori. The boy answered quickly, currently weaving in and out of halls in search of a way to apprehend Bakugo. Uraraka, what is it? Ada found me. Sorry, she sighed. And he moved everything, so I've got nothing to fight with. Midoriya scowled. That's all right. Where are you? 5th floor, right in the center. He looked up. So right above me. I'll be there as fast as I can. Just stall and stay on the defensive. The teen then heard a CLCK and turned his eyes back to the hall to see Bakugo standing in front of him. His one remaining gauntlet was pointed right at him. He quickly let his partner go to put his full attention on the boy. The blonde chuckled. I'm sure you know from all your stalking, but he took offense at that statement, but didn't let it show. He didn't consider his analysis stalking. Sure, maybe it was a bit invasive and maybe it freaked people out, but stalking? No way. The sweat glands on my palms secrete. He continued, something like nitroglycerin. That's how I make my explosions. Midoriya quickly put the pieces together. The sweat, the gauntlet, the smug grin on his face. Don't tell me he's gonna. Gami, who had stayed on the sidelines most of the fight, stepped in to consult his successor. Be careful. Assuming they honored my design request. This gauntlet had been storing that fluid. He kept on. Call it revenge for destroying my other gauntlet. All Might immediately interrupted through the intercom, his outburst scaring the observing students. Bakugo, don't. You'll kill him. The blonde smiled psychotically. He won't die if he dodges. Midoriya barely heard the pin get pulled out and clink to the ground before all hell broke loose. He reacted as fast as possible. There was no room for hesitation as he felt his hair scorch. He flexed his hand and summoned his scythe. Not skipping a beat, he unleashed the dam and released his DT into his weapon as if it were a wild, savage beast. He swung the blade to meet the blast, his previous preparation merely lasting a second. The shockwave met the blast and the two fought for DMNC. Uraraka and Ada held their ground as the entire building shook on its foundation. All Might and the other students could only watch the cameras as Bakugo fought to prove and Midoriya fought to live. A second went by, but the two forces continued to struggle. Finally, the teen's shockwave won, but just barely. It pushed all the dust, smoke, and debris towards the angry blonde, who had to shield his eyes. Midoriya didn't waste a single moment, though, and distanced himself. His eyes landed on his exit and he formulated a plan. The smoke didn't disappear right away, but he could still make out Bakugo's deranged smile, and it scared him. He quickly lowered his form to continue hiding in the smoke. He could tell the blonde was looking for him. Come on out, Deku, he teased. I want to crush you. The boy would not fall for the taunt, though, and instead searched the ground for something. His fingers ran over a small stone and he grinned. While hidden in the smoke, he tossed the stone to the other side of the damaged room. Bakugo heard a stone get kicked and narrowed in on his prey. Time to P&DU. Midoriya stayed low to the ground and crawled away from the blonde, towards his exit. The smoke was still decently thick, and he was going to use that to his advantage. He threw another piece of debris to another corner of the room, hoping to confuse him. Gami watched his successor lead the blonde around the room, playing him for a fool. He was proud of his friend's cunning genius, but also relieved that he wasn't too badly injured. The sneaky teen tossed around a few more stones and could hear Bakugo grow more and more frustrated. After one final throw, he left the scene and headed up to meet his partner. Once he was sure Bakugo couldn't hear him, he tried to contact her, but realized his comm was out. He pushed his exhausted body to run faster up the stairs into the room where Uraraka had told him she was. He ran into the room, much to the surprise of Ida and his partner. The brunette quickly regrouped with him. Midori, are you all right? She pressed. Just a bit roughed up. But I'll be fine, he replied. We don't have too much time, though. I'm not sure how long Bakugo will stay distracted. She nodded. Well, I tried to grab the weapon myself, but Ada keeps moving it around. He huffed. Ada's speed would definitely be a problem. Initiate Plan B then. All right. The boy playing a villain was confused. What did this Plan B have in store for him? Midoriya quickly ran over to a support pillar closest to his partner and slammed his hands down onto it. It happened so fast, Ida had no time to react. The concrete pillar decayed almost instantaneously, and Uraraka grabbed it and activated her quirk. She lifted the pillar up over her head, now finally having a weapon. "Let's go, Midori," she cried. He grunted in response and followed up with both hands on the floor. The decay spread throughout the floor and it crumbled to pieces, exposing the floor below. The gap stretched all the way from left to right, leaving Ida no room to run away with the weapon. The teen quickly realized the parallels of this scene to his premonition, but was too caught up in the moment. Bakugo, who was directly under, figured out that the boy had tricked him and stormed up to fight him. As the debris flew around the room, he called out, "Now Uraraka." She swung the pillar, the force of the swing blowing the debris right at Ida's face. "Home run Comet." The armored student raised his hands to shield his face, and the hero team saw their chance. "Now's your chance," Midoriya yelled to his partner. "Go Uraraka." The brunette reacted quickly, dropping the concrete support pillar and touching her chest. She activated her quirk on herself and launched herself into the air, right above Ida's head. The teen watched as their plan unfolded to the smallest detail, of course, not without a few hitches. But he still watched in awe as Uraraka hugged the weapon, securing it for the team. Weapon secured. All Might's voice rang over all the comms, though Midoriya couldn't hear it. The hero team wins. And finally, the fight was over. The first thing the hero team did was barf. Well, more accurately, it was Uraraka who did the puking. Ida, being on the same side of the makeshift canyon as her, ran to her fallen form to help her as best he could. Gami floated over to greet his successor. "That was certainly an eventful fight," the man began. "You did well." The shy boy didn't believe him. "You really think so?" "I know so." "Hey Midoriya." He flinched at the name, but immediately knew it was Ida who was calling him. He turned to see his partner back on her feet and the other boy standing next to her. They carefully made their way back over the large gap using the pillar Uraraka had discarded. Soon enough, they were at his side. "That was quite the spectacular plan B," Ida continued. "But if I may, what was plan A?" The brunette took over. "Well, that was in case you hadn't moved anything out of the room for me. I was going to float as many things as I could while Midori batted them at you." Midoriya jumped back in. "It was our plan A because it was less risky and easier to execute. We knew that plan B was a bit dangerous, especially if this scenario had been for real, but we factored that in to make it as safe for a nuclear weapon as possible." Ida looked impressed. "Well, I am amazed. You certainly had the brains, power, and teamwork to win this challenge. I am not at all bothered to have been beaten by you two." The three smiled and laughed together. No one was majorly injured, and there weren't any strong feelings between them. They all congregated by the room's only exit to talk some more, oblivious to the dreadful hurricane headed their way. Bakugo reached the 5th floor and quickly found the room that Deku was in. He was seething mad. How dare the nerd play him like that, tricking him into thinking he was still somewhere in the smoke. It wasn't even just that. The whole time Deku had simply read him like a book, calculating his every move with terrifying accuracy. And that pisses him off. He wasn't going to let him off that easy. He stood in the doorway, surprising the three students, Deku. They all turned around in shock, and that's when Midoriya remembered his foresight. He couldn't believe he had forgotten something like that, even for a second. The boy tensed, ready to act when he needed to. The raging blonde kept talking. "You played me like a DMN fool. I bet you think you're so smart, don't you?" He raised his only gauntlet up at him, his mind too full of anger to properly realize what he was doing. That same anger had given him enough sweat to fire off another large blast if he needed to. The teens gasped in shock. Ida was the first to reply. "Bakugo, what do you think you're doing?" All Might and the rest of the class watched in horror from the monitor room. The hero tried to de-escalate the situation. "Bakugo, the training exercise is over." But the blonde either didn't hear the pro or simply ignored him. "I'll tell you what I think, UFC King Runt. I think you should learn your place." It was like slow motion. Both Midoriya and Gami watched as Bakugo pulled the pin out of his gauntlet for the second time. This was it. It was happening. The same scene he had witnessed at the subway station was unfolding in front of his very eyes. The explosion was too large. It was going to hit Ida and Uraraka as well. They were going to be blown into the hole in the floor. They would land on the floor below. Their spines would snap. They were going to die. He prayed. He prayed to the universe so desperately in that moment that he could reach his friends before they were hit. Uraraka and Ida were still crying out in shock, neither even realizing what was truly happening. They were too caught off guard to think about using their quirks. The two were simply in pure disbelief that a classmate would attack them in such a manner. Each frantic step the boy took was issued with so much force, he was afraid his legs would break. But he just kept on running towards his friends, who he watched in slow motion try to protect themselves from the blast. He had to make it. He just had to. "I have to get there." He reached out his arms desperately, hoping, praying, to feel something between his ungloved fingers. He couldn't fail them. He wouldn't be able to live with himself. That it was his fault Bakugo had fired, and they just got caught in the midst. It was like a blessing. almost as if the universe finally granted his poor heart a wish that he managed to feel two different arms in his grasp. Without hesitation, he roughly shoved both Ida and Uraraka out of the way, just as he felt the heat of the explosion touch his costume. It wasn't a second later that he was blown off his feet. There was so much chaos going on, he didn't even realize that his friends were watching him in horror as he went over the edge. He felt himself fall through the hole he had made to win the training exercise, down to the spot on the 4th floor where he had tricked Bakugo with the stones. Even now, he could still tell there was still smoke on the ground. That massive explosion was truly impressive. He wasn't sure when exactly he had hit the ground, but after what seemed like forever, his vision went dark. Midoriya didn't know how long it had been since he lost consciousness, but assumed it wasn't long considering he was still laying on the wrecked 4th floor. His whole body hurt, so he didn't bother trying to get up. His mentor was at his side and kneeled down at his wake. "GG Gami," he struggled to say. Even his breaths were painful. What happened? Do not move. You were hit by Bakugo's explosion. His first thought went to his friends, who had also been up there. They are safe. It sounded like the ghost was crying. Please, worry about yourself. His mind SWCH back into rational mode. Damages. Your injuries are severe. You cannot move, no matter what. The boy listened obediently. Tell me, your arm is impaled on a metal rod. I do not know if any of your other bones are broken. He couldn't see his arms from the angle he was at, but trusted in his companion's words. His neck ached so badly, it reminded him of the phantom pains earlier this morning. With each breath it felt as if his chest was collapsing on him. He was in so much pain, he just wished it would end already. Tired. The spirit knew his successor couldn't die, but that didn't mean he wanted him to fall back into unconsciousness again. And no, fight it off, Izuku. You have to stay awake. The teen didn't want to disappoint his mentor, so he fought off the darkness as much as he wanted it to consume him. He was running out of energy though, and only managed to stay awake longer enough to see some robots rolling towards him. Then, he truly succumbed to his urge to sleep. Midoriya wouldn't lie, he was a bit disappointed to wake up again. But his eyes did flutter open, and once they did, he realized he was in what looked to be a hospital. But upon closer inspection, he realized it wasn't a hospital at all. It was the school's NRSNG office. He slowly craned his neck to the left and was met by an immediate scolding. Don't move your head. Your spine is still fragile. It took him a moment, but he recognized the voice to be Recovery Girl's. That made sense. She was the school's nurse, but he didn't listen and moved his head around again. Aizawa and Nezu were also in the office. What were they doing here? Midoriya. The principal began. It's so good to see you awake. How are you feeling? The boy wasn't sure if he could speak coherent sentences, but he took a try. Hurts. A lot. What happened? His homeroom teacher stepped in. Bakugo fired off an explosion at you, Ida, and Uraraka after the exercise was over. You managed to push them out of the way and took the brunt of the hit. You fell to the floor below and landed on your back, damaging your spine and impaling your left arm. He looked down at his arm and sure enough, there was a large scar in his forearm, the size of a metal rod. That's when he realized his arms were exposed and he was still in his hero costume. The sleeves had been ripped off. Recovery Girl piped up at that. The damage to your spinal cord should have killed you. It was in complete shambles, and yet when I used my quirk on you, it simply healed as if it were a normal injury. You need to explain yourself. It was a bit inconsiderate that the heroine was asking him to spill his secrets after he had nearly died. But at locking eyes with Nezu, he caved, knowing it was for the better. Have I immortality? The older lady clearly wasn't expecting that, but the principal jumped right back in to explain. Midoriya has been hiding a lot of things concerning his true abilities for his own safety. I will explain everything to you later. Midoriya hoped that was the end of the questions, and the teachers would let him rest in peace, but he was sorely mistaken. We just have one more thing, Midoriya, Nezu continued, before we must go. The teen just nodded. He noticed Gami at his bedside, holding his hand gently. He squeezed it tightly, just to let the man know he was okay. Well, as okay as he could be right now. Midoriya, we had to take off your costume to perform a medical exam on you. The nurse picked up, and I noticed some concerning things. Concerning things. What in Paradise's name was she talking about? You have a massive scar on your chest, as well as numerous ones on your arms. None of those were from today's incident. So I must ask. She explained, where did you get those? OSHT. OFCK. Of course, he didn't respond right away, so the heroine continued her onslaught. I'm a nurse. I know plenty about how scars form. The one on your chest is clearly a burn scar, and the others were strong to figure out at first. But from their depth, I can tell they're from glass shards. Nezu tagged himself in. We just want to know where you got them from, Midoriya. Can you tell us? Aizawa still hadn't said a word. The boy could feel himself panicking. SHD, they had already found out about his whole role as Death. He couldn't just tell them his whole tragic sob story. Then what would happen? Would they deem him too much a risk to stay at UA? Or worse, send him off to some prison so he couldn't take his revenge if he wanted to? Which he didn't. But his rationality went out the window at that moment, and all the worst possible scenarios ran through his mind. Izu, you have to tell them. They might even be able to help you. Midoriya completely forgot that Gami was invisible to anyone other than him, or that Recovery Girl didn't even know about his existence. His mouth simply opened and he didn't think. You expect me to tell everything to complete strangers? They already interrogated me yesterday. No one said a word after, and that's how he had realized he just said that aloud. It was so quiet. The boy swore he could hear the pin from Bakugo's gauntlet fall over and over again. He really screwed up this time. Nezu was the first to respond, and he wasn't as composed as before. You were talking to Gami-san again, right, Midoriya? The boy was completely embarrassed in himself. Why, yeah, I'm sorry, sir. But the principal didn't stop there. He knew the look on his student's face. It was the look of years of SBMSN, of pain, of abuse, something he had gone through himself many years ago. You're being hurt at home, aren't you, Midoriya? He snapped up from his hospital bed, startling the teachers in the room and air. The words were foaming at his mouth and came out incoherent. He clutched at his chest, right where he knew the burn scar from his father laid. Aizawa finally took charge of the situation. How about we ask you questions, and you answer? Does that sound okay? He couldn't put the words together, so he just nodded his head solemnly. Eraserhead didn't stop. When did you get that scar on your chest? He hesitated, but the ghost next to him gave him a slight nudge. When I was 4. Recovery Girl asked next. Did someone give it to you? The teen nodded shakily. My father. How is Quirk? Nezu picked up there. Can you explain? He took a shaky swallow. His Quirk is fire breathing. He burned me 3 nights after my Quirk diagnosis and never came back. Aizawa realized at that statement that no one actually knew the boy's true Quirk. What was the diagnosis? Oh God, why? Why was everything unraveling like this? Take your time, dearie, he heard the older woman say. I didn't. He forced the words to come out. I didn't have a Quirk. So he didn't want me. The room was silent. No one said a word or asked another question. Midoriya didn't want to hear the empty nothingness though, so he just kept on like he did with Todoroki, hoping to change the subject. The words came out easier when he was deflecting anyway. My mom became an alcoholic after he left. She blames me for everything. He rambled. She comes home late though, so I don't see her often. Still, no one said anything. He was growing more and more nervous and could feel his panic take over his form. He realized he still didn't have his gloves on. My gloves. I need my gloves. He yanked his arms up from the hospital bed, ignoring the IV in one. Holding them up in midair, he made sure his fingertips weren't touching anything. Aizawa was the first to figure out what was happening, his rational mind kicking into overdrive. He's losing control of his powers right now, the normally tired man exclaimed, remembering the boy had told them his powers acted up under emotional distress. We need something he can use it on. Recovery Girl quickly tossed the pro a clipboard, and he threw it at the student in the hospital bed. In hindsight, that probably wasn't a good idea, but luckily the student caught it. The clipboard disintegrated to mere dust in an instant. The boy calmed down. Gami rummaged through the remains of his hero costume currently on the floor and managed to find and pull out a pair of discarded gloves. The pocket they were once in was nothing more than shreds of fabric. The ghost somehow was able to hold them and toss them into his successor's lap. The teachers were surprised at a pair of gloves seemingly moving on their own, but the man and the rodent knew the truth to what was happening. Thanks, Gami, he answered and slipped them on. Instantly, he felt relaxed and nearly fell asleep. He leaned back into the bed, returning to a calm state. Nezu tugged a paw at Aizawa's breathed leg. Well, we will be going now, Midoriya. Please, rest up. I hope to see you out of here later. The principal left and his homeroom teacher quickly followed. Recovery Girl was the only one left in the room, besides the spirit of course. She walked over to him and gave him a quick embrace on the forehead. The teen could feel his energy drain away. Get some rest, dearie, she spoke softly. You need it. For the 3rd time, his eyes closed and he was off to dreamland. God, could this day get any worse? Midoriya awoke some time later and was deemed in stable enough condition by Recovery Girl to return to class. He wasn't sure how much time had passed, but he was definitely sure that all of the other training battles were already over. That disappointed him as he was excited to see his classmates' quirks in action, but what could he really do? The nurse had told him to be careful moving around as his spine was still fragile, but he wouldn't have to worry about snapping it. The hole in his arm was fully healed, and only a small, round scar remained. Most of his stamina was gone, since Recovery Girl had used it to speed up his healing, so he was now groggily dragging himself down the hallway. The heroine had given him a spare uniform to wear, since his costume was so mangled. His arms were now completely covered, with thick bandages around one. He used his signature glove-covered hands to pull open his classroom door, the mere action putting serious strain on his body. He barely got the door open when someone called his name. "Oh, Midoriya's here. Welcome back, man," one student with red, spiky hair cried. The door was flung open for him, and the boy was immediately bombarded by his class. He backed away in discomfort, still an emotional mess from earlier in the nurse's office, but the crowd was dispelled by two worried students, who shoved their way to the front. "Oh, Midori," Uraraka whimpered out with concern. "Are you okay?" He reached out to her. "I'm fine, but..." Ada was trying to hold some students back from tackling him, but that didn't mean he wasn't concerned as well. "Midoriya, you're not seriously injured, are you?" "No, well I was," he started, "but I'm fine now. So please don't worry." The brunette jumped back in, nearly embracing him before she remembered he was hurt. "You took the hit for us. I was terrified when I saw you go over." The teen's mind flashed back to his premonition, but he pushed it away. It hadn't come true. He had stopped it. He had saved them. "I couldn't let you guys get hit. You're my friends after all." Ada looked heartwarmed. "Still, I must ask you please be more self-conserving." You had the entire class petrified. Midoriya was positive that it wasn't the whole class, but still, he had never had so many people worried about him. "I'll try." He flashed a smile. Uraraka wiped away a few tears and gave him a gentle hug, unable to resist anymore. He flinched at first, but slowly hugged back. The touch didn't feel as uncomfortable as it would have back at Aldera. Maybe that was a sign that things were getting better. "We're just so glad you're all right," she sniffled. The girl eventually backed away and smiled in return. Ada, having done his version of damage control, now stood next to her. His glasses hid any stray droplets that may have escaped. But now that the two students had properly checked on their friend, the rest of the class pounced. The red-haired boy came back up to him. "I don't know what you were saying back there, but that was a wild battle." A girl with pink skin and yellow horns spoke next. "Your dodging was so good." Another student with brown hair and plump lips interrupted. "We were all super pumped after that crazy first round." The shy teen just smiled awkwardly during all of that. I'm afraid I don't know all your names just yet." The red, spiky-haired boy introduced himself first. "I'm Kirishima Ijiru. Your fight was so manly." "I'm Ashido Mina." The pink female went next. "You dodged really well." "I'm Asui Tsuyu," said the frog girl Midoriya had noticed a few times, "but you can call me Tsu." The brunette only introduced himself with his family name. "And I'm Sato." Midoriya's smile turned genuine. "Well, I'm Midoriya Izuku, but I'm sure you already knew that. Though, I'd prefer to be called by a nickname." The newly introduced Ashido cheered. "Well, I heard you're going by Midori, so I'll just call you that. Plus it's cute." The boy wasn't sure how he felt at being considered cute, but the rest of the class quickly latched onto the name, so he didn't mind. Plus, he actually enjoyed the nickname quite a lot. Ashido was a very animated person, and he realized that very quickly. But that didn't mean he was expecting her to slap a hand on his back. He hissed in pain and she moved it frantically. "Oh, I'm so sorry." She apologized. No, it's fine," he reassured. "My spine is still a bit sensitive." Ada activated worried dad mode at that. "But you told us you weren't seriously injured." "Well, I was, but recovery girl healed me up." He tried to clarify. Uraraka leapt on Ada's bandwagon. "Midori, how badly were you hurt?" The teen waved his hands dismissively. "Guys, I'm fine now. You really don't need to worry." But at his friend's unbelieving looks, he caved. "My spine was badly damaged when I fell." That was definitely an understatement, but he didn't want to tell his friends that he should technically be dead. "And I got my arm stuck on a metal rod, but I'm fine now." The brunette clasped her hands over her mouth in shock. "Oh my god." Ada only grew more worried. "Will you be all right to continue your hero studies?" The rest of the class seemed interested in that. "Why yeah, I told you guys, I'm practically brand new again. I just need a good night's sleep." That was finally enough to de-escalate the situation and calm his friend's nerves. His body ached from simply standing, so Uraraka and Ada finally allowed him a moment to breathe and let him sit down alone at his desk. He carefully leaned back in his chair so as to not aggravate his spine further, and let out a deep sigh he had been holding since waking up for the first time in Recovery Girl's office. But even then, the universe would not allow him a single moment of peace. Though, the peace breaker ended up being Todoroki, so it wasn't as bad as it could have potentially been. "I know you have been insistent on your condition," the boy started, "but are you truly all right, Izuku?" He widened his smile. "Yeah, don't worry. I'm not referring to your injuries," he interrupted bluntly. Geez, he really couldn't slip anything past this kid. His smile fell. "How could you tell? Is it really that obvious?" The candy cane student shook his head. "It's not, but your eyes give it away." "Do you want to talk about it?" Midoriya gulped. It was weighing heavy on his chest, but he didn't want to put that kind of strain on a friend. Todoroki noticed the hesitation. "Yesterday, you said you wanted to work through this together. That means you have to talk as well." He was sure the boy didn't mean to put it that rudely, but he got the message. "Recovery girl saw my scars," he whispered quietly, hoping not to attract any unwanted attention. "She brought in Aizawa-sensei and Nezu-san." The red and white-haired boy stiffened. I'm assuming you told them. I didn't want to. He mumbled with a slight whimper, picking at his gloves, but they practically figured it out themselves. I don't know what to do. What do you mean? The teen looked up, finding it unnaturally easy to open up the boy in front of him. I'm scared. If they decided to do something, where am I going to go? I can't stay with my father. Hell, I don't even know where he is. What if I'm put into a different home? Will I even be able to come to UA anymore? Todoroki cut off his frantic rambling, but softened at his desperate look. I'm sure it will all end up all right. But what if it doesn't? The student reached into the back pocket of his uniform and pulled out a small sliver of paper, neatly cut and folded. Here, we'll figure this out together. Then Todoroki returned to his seat. Midoriya didn't miss the fact that he had said together. He unfolded the piece of paper, only to see a phone number on it. Well, that was smooth. The teen socked his mentor strong in the arm. He was sure the student only meant it as a means of communication, so he wouldn't feel as alone. But that also made him wonder, did Todoroki prepare the paper beforehand to give it to him, or did he just have random slips of paper with his number on it for emergencies? Either way, it seemed a bit strange, but he took the gesture as a friendly one. He entered the number into his phone and labeled the contact Shouto. Gami watched as he did, but did not spare him from any teasing. Given name, the spirit joked. Be quiet, he hissed under his breath. You weren't saying anything yesterday. He did not give you his number yesterday. Oh, you're unbearable. The boy huffed, but the ghost didn't miss the small smirk on his face. I thought you were more mature than this. The man sighed. I have been mature for over 5 centuries. Let me have this. He rolled his eyes. Whatever you say. The duo chatted sparingly since they were still in class, but eventually the bell rang and Midoriya got ready to leave. He wasn't sure if he would get to go home or not. Maybe he was just overthinking things. He slipped his backpack on as Uraraka and Ida joined him. Together, the three made their way out of the classroom, only to be stopped by Aizawa at the door again. Midoriya, he began, I need you to go to Recovery Girl. She wants to do one last checkup before you leave. Darn, the brunette sighed. We've been foiled again. Sorry guys, he replied. Ida reassured him, it is completely fine. We'd rather have you in the best shape possible, even if that means we do not walk to the subway together. The group walked together down the hallway, but split once the reserve boy reached the nurse's office. He entered the room, to which only the heroine was there. She motioned for him to sit on the bed and started to check him over. Nezu explained your situation to me, she stated. Though, he wasn't sure what to say. Is, Gami in here? The older woman asked. He looked over to his ghostly companion. Yeah, he's standing at the foot of the bed. Please tell her I thank her for taking care of you. You are far too reckless for your own good. He wants to thank you for healing me, the teen repeated. He also thinks I'm too reckless. The heroine laughed. Well, I'm certainly inclined to agree with him. Though, your injuries seem to be healing fine. You should be back to normal by tomorrow. Oh, that's wonderful, Midoriya. Both parties turned to see the principal and a tired teacher walk into the office. Nezu had a bright smile on his face and Eraserhead seemed merely indifferent. Nezu-san, he greeted, Aizawa-sensei. What are you doing here? The rodent's smile fell to more of a neutral face. Well, we have decided what to do about your situation. Midoriya instantly tensed. Gami moved to stand closer to his successor. He continued, as a school, it is our responsibility that all of our students are kept safe, and that includes both on our premise and at home. Aizawa-san and I have come to the conclusion that returning home isn't a safe option for you. He wasn't sure how to feel about that. Sure, he didn't really want to go home, but that was all he knew. What would happen to him now? Nezu took a step forward. I don't think that putting you into a foster home right now will necessarily help your mental state as a growing teenager. Plus, I'm assuming you would need to hide your role as a Grim Reaper from anyone new that you'd be living with. For the last time, Gami, he shushed, I'm sorry. Please continue. Aizawa raised an eyebrow. He realized the principal was going off script. This wasn't what they had discussed. Leave it to the chaotic rodent to throw a wrench into the gears at the last minute. So, as principal, I have access to a better option for you that would ensure you remain enrolled as well as out of your household. The boy fiddled with his gloves nervously. Well, that's good I guess. Unfortunately, this solution will only be temporary until UA officially works out all the details with the police. So, what's going to happen to me? He wondered why the principal was stalling so much. Well, I'll be using the school's executive power to pull you from your home, since we've deemed it unstable for you to live under. Nezu paused briefly. And you'll be staying with Aizawa-san in the meantime. What? Midoriya cried out in shock. Aizawa turned to the principal. This is not what we discussed. Nezu just smirked sadistically. Things don't always go according to plan. Now do they, Aizawa-san? Midoriya stayed quiet as Aizawa argued with Nezu, who just seemed to be enjoying the situation. He hadn't moved from his spot on the hospital bed. Recovery Girl wasn't making eye contact with him anymore and had simply moved to her desk. Gami floated over to sit next to him. but after deeming his form too unstable to make contact with the bed, he just stood by the boy. His successor hadn't moved a muscle since the principal's declaration, and that concerned the ghost. "Are you doing all right?" He didn't respond. The teachers just kept fighting. Is it because of Eraserhead's reaction? Again, no response. Is it the change then? Is it because you are being forced somewhere new? No answer. Was it just the day? Has today been too much? Nothing. The teen wasn't sure what was wrong with him, honestly. It just felt like the air had been pulled from his lungs, like he was gasping on nothingness. He felt empty and alone, despite the yelling in the room and the words coming from his mentor. He wasn't sure if going home was what he wanted, but at the same time, he wasn't sure if going with Aizawa was what he wanted either. I mean, it was obvious that the man wasn't jumping for joy either. He didn't want to cause any more problems for anyone, but was that worth going back home? He really didn't know. Midoriya. The boy jumped a bit, startled at the call, but otherwise made no effort to respond. Once he realized it was the principal calling him, he made a small hum of confirmation, but nothing more. Nezu figured he finally had the student's attention. Sorry about all of that. Aizawa-san is going to stay with me for a bit to finish the finalities. But don't worry, he's having Yamada-san pick you up. Midoriya's breath hitched at the name, the unfamiliarity sparking something like primal fear. His hand was halfway to his chest before he stopped it and moved it back to his side. Gami must have understood the same thing, as he took a threatening step towards the rodent. "Are you sure about this, sir?" he whispered. "I really don't want to be any trouble." The principal elbowed the tired man in the leg, but it wasn't caught by either of the deathly duo. Aizawa definitely did, on the other hand, and stifled a curse. "Trust me, Midoriya," he assured, "you're no trouble at all." The teen wasn't convinced, but he flashed a small smile anyway. He gripped his backpack straps tightly, digging his gloved fingers into the LTHR. He watched Nezu make a slight movement with his paw and took it as a gesture to stand up from the bed. He wobbled on his feet, but grabbed at the bed for balance. He was still suffering from lightheadedness due to Recovery Girl's quirk, but forced himself to stand nonetheless. Then there was a knock on the door. "Oh, that must be Yamada-sen now," Nezu exclaimed, clapping his paws together. "Come in." Midoriya didn't really know who this Yamada was, but he picked up some important tidbits about the person. 1. Aizawa knew Yamada on some sort of personal level and probably trusted him, even if the hero was making it blatantly obvious that he wasn't looking forward to fostering him. He knew the man's rational mind wouldn't allow him to do things half-but. So if the man was truly having someone else pick him up, he wouldn't have just chosen someone randomly. 2. Yamada must work at UA. To have arrived at the nurse's office so quickly, it was likely the man was a hero, and subsequently, a teacher. Most of his current teachers hadn't introduced themselves yet, so he was stuck calling them by their hero names. Yamada could be one of his teachers then. Or maybe he was a teacher he didn't have, like a gen ed or a support course teacher. Of course, there was always the possibility that this mysterious man wasn't a teacher at all. But other than that, he really knew nothing about the man. So imagine the boy's surprise when he watched Present Mike, his English teacher, walk into the room. "Hey Sho, you needed something?" the loud man asked cheerily. The teacher stopped right at the doorway, realizing the awkwardness of the situation. Aizawa stared at him blankly, while Nezu stood by his feet and waved. Recovery Girl had moved away to her desk a while back, and just seemed to be ignoring the situation. Midoriya reacted, though it was only his gaze, and Gami turned his whole form to now face the door. "I'm sure you both already know each other," the principal started. "But anyway, Yamada-san, this is Midoriya Izuku from the hero course." "Midoriya, this is Yamada, but you probably know him better as Present Mike." The newly introduced teacher chuckled awkwardly. "Well, hello little listener. Just like the principal said, I'm Yamada Hazashi." The teen gulped quietly, not knowing what to say. "I apologize for having Aizawa-san call you here on such short notice," Nezu continued, "but I'm afraid it's pretty important." Yamada grew serious. "It's no problem at all." "What is it?" The rodent gestured for the student to come closer, so he did, walking over to stand beside Nezu and in front of his English teacher. His mind was racing, and yet his throat felt like a desert. Was he going to be staying with Aizawa still? Or was Present Mike picking him up so he could stay with him? What would happen to his mother, or his notebooks, or his plants? How long would this last? When would he have to find a new family? Well, Nezu smiled a wide and unnerving smile, one that shook the boy to his core. "You and Aizawa-san will be fostering Midoriya for some time, so I need you to take him back to your apartment to get settled in." The teen deadpanned. The principal sure had a way of being straightforward. When Yamada told his husband that he wanted a child, this wasn't quite what he was expecting. Currently, the two had left the school and were walking down an empty street. The hero had changed out of his clothes to not draw attention, and combed his hair down from his signature look. His hands were stuffed in his LTHR jacket pockets and his jeans ruffled around in the breeze. And yet, as comfortable as he was, not a word had been uttered since they left the nurse's office. Midoriya walked next to him, eyes downcast and hands tightly wrapped around his backpack straps. He debated burrowing his fingers into the bottom of his uniform top, but decided against it to not make any more unnecessary wrinkles. His analytic mind was beaming at the thought of strolling beside a pro hero, but somber shadows quickly restrained his excitement and brought back the dread. He was pretty sure he was spiraling again, as the unwelcome feeling of drowning in agony returned, but there wasn't much he could do in the moment. He was positive the pro didn't know about his situation, and that was not a conversation he wanted to have in the moment. Gami simply floated behind the two silently, observing every step the hero took. His successor had first introduced him to this man back at the entrance exam briefing, and back then, he was sure the hero was only a loud and obnoxious individual. But now, he wasn't so sure. The silence must have gotten to the man, as he was used to naturally talking, so he finally spoke. "So Midoriya, you want to tell me more about yourself? I've only known you since these first 2 days of school." Yamada knew he was a lot of things, but an idiot was not one of them. He had a good idea of what was going on. Yue didn't typically pull kids from their homes often, but it had happened enough that he understood the protocol. He knew that this student's home life must be bad enough for Nezu to act so quickly. But there was no way he was going to open a conversation asking this kid about home, especially in an area so public as this. And still, when the boy looked up at him to respond, his heartstrings were tugged violently. He looked so alone and unsure of himself. When he saw the kid in his class, he just chalked it up to being nervous or introverted. But now that he had a better idea of where his skittish behavior had come from, it tore apart his heart. The hero couldn't understand what would compel anyone to hurt a child like this, especially one as shy and sweet as Midoriya. The teen stuttered, trying to gather up the confidence to speak. "I like analysis and gardening." The man leached onto that information, hoping to keep the boy talking. "Oh, analysis. Do you analyze anything in particular?" This wasn't Yamada's first time assisting Yue in a sensitive situation. He knew how to tread around topics that were sensitive and to encourage a student to talk about something they enjoyed. He'll like to think he was decent enough in handling children, though this was the first time he'd ever be fostering one. He watched the boy light up. I do quirk analysis. Most of my notes are on pro heroes, as since they're so easy to research. I wanted to write some notes on my classmates, but I'm afraid they'll think it's weird." The teacher was impressed. "Have you analyzed any heroes here at UA? And why would they think it's weird?" Midoriya felt the shadows loosen their hold and retreat, and his head clocked into overdrive. I have. I've done pretty much all the heroes that work at UA. You, Midnight, Cementos, even Aizawa-sensei." Then he grew nervous, and the brightness in his eyes dimmed. He fiddled with his gloves anxiously and took a second to breathe before continuing. "Most people find it creepy that I observe them so closely. I think it freaks people out that I'm able to dissect their quirks and their weaknesses so quickly." Yamada hummed. "Well, what have you done on me? If you don't mind me asking." Well, your quirk is voice, and it allows you to amplify the volume of your voice to do damage, but that's pretty obvious on its own." The teen paused to try and recall his notes to the fullest extent. By itself, it's a pretty basic quirk, but that allows a lot of room for creativity. He looked up to the man, almost waiting for confirmation to continue. The pro glanced down at him, tilting his glasses to his nose. He flashed a small smile and gave a slight nod, which provided just enough confidence for Midoriya to keep talking. "You already have your directional speaker system for support, but that's barely the tip of the iceberg." "Wait a minute," he interrupted. "My directional speaker what?" The student looked lost. The thing around your neck." He waved a finger to his own neck to emphasize. The hero laughed. "Oh, so that's what that is called." The deathly duo shared a look of disbelief. Gami simply shrugged back, so the boy returned his gaze to the sidewalk in front of him. "Well, considering your quirk, there are a lot of ways to give yourself advantages in combat. Creating echoes would be a great way to increase the volume and range of your quirk, and it would confuse villains as well." He stopped, raising a finger to his chin and thought, though, that would be difficult to achieve on your own. Pairing with Cementos would be ideal, but that's not exactly how it works during an emergency. "Echoes," Yamada repeated. "I've never thought of that." Midoriya must have not heard him, because he just kept rambling. "While you do have support gear already, there's a lot of room to expand. Have you ever thought of smaller, long-range speakers? They can be connected to you by a wire so you can throw them out like a grenade. Then, all you have to do is yell into the existing system around your neck and the sound will be directed out to the mini speakers." The teen realized he had been talking for a while and looked up to his teacher to check in on him. The lost look on his face was all he needed to see to understand that he had been rambling again. "Basically sound grenades," he re-explained, "powered by your quirk." Oh, he realized, that actually sounds pretty handy. He looked down bashfully at the praise. The fact that he had just been giving a pro hero support tips finally CLC-king in his head. Now that he was done talking, his consciousness started to creep back and made him feel unsure of himself once again. His mentor did his best to reassure him, but even the ghost's pats and hair ruffles weren't enough. Anyone who would think that's weird is insane. Yamada spoke up, interrupting his spiraling thoughts. Your analysis is really helpful. Midoriya did a double take. Really? Yeah, the man exclaimed. Your outside analysis is super beneficial to anyone looking to expand on their quirk. Just makes me want to say yeah. The teen was about to respond when the loud man in front of him stopped suddenly, making him skid to a stop as well. Gami wasn't paying attention to either, and stumbled into his successor. The impact made him shift a few paces, but he corrected himself before his teacher could ask question. They had finally arrived at a small house, only a few blocks away from the school. It was an unassuming gray color, with few windows and a dark roof. Despite the boring colors, it felt actually quite welcoming, almost as if it was inviting him inside. There was a soft CLCK, and then the front door swung open. The pro held it open with one extended arm, beckoning the student to walk inside. There was a slight moment of hesitation, but the home's ambient warmth soon engulfed him and he entered. He wiped his red sneakers off on the mat, but didn't know whether to take them off or not, so he waited until Yamada walked in as well and shut the door. The hero took off his shoes and left them on the side of the mat, so Midoriya did the same. His English teacher rushed off to the main hallway, so he took off after him. He wasn't sure where the man was headed. Maybe he should have stayed by the door until he got a direct command. This was our guest room, he suddenly explained, stopping at a door, but Kayama doesn't come over that often, so we don't really need it. He turned to look at the boy behind him, only to meet a confused expression. "Aw, sorry," he sighed. "I keep forgetting you don't know us by our names." "Kayama is Midnight." Midoriya nodded. Gami grew closer to him. "Seems like a lot of the teachers at UA have close relations." That was true. Present Mike seemed to be close to Aizawa in some way, and he also knew Midnight personally enough that she would come over. Who knows how long they had been friends? Maybe when they started their hero careers, maybe even earlier. "I'm sure Sho won't mind this becoming your room." That short-circuited his brain in an instant. There was a lot to unpack in that one singular statement. He was getting his own room. Now, it wasn't like he hadn't had a bedroom before. He obviously had his own room living with his mother, but the room never really felt like it was his. It just felt like a mouse hole in the wall, and like he was a stowaway rat. Sure, it was his room, but it never really belonged to him. Second, and probably the most shocking, was what his teacher had implied when designating the guest room as his own. He figured that Sho was the man's nickname for Aizawa, based on the fact that he had addressed his homeroom teacher like that when entering the nurse's office. But bringing up the pro hero like that could only mean that this was Aizawa's home. This would have to be Eraserhead's house, or else it wouldn't matter what the tired teacher thought. And that brought up a whole new set of questions. Did that mean that present Mike was living with him? Were they roommates, in a relationship? Or was the loud hero not living here? Did he simply just have a spare key? Even if that was the case, that still meant that Aizawa trusted him a large deal to give someone a key to his home. Midoriya. Yamada's yelling jolted him out of his endless thoughts, and he blinked a few times to try and get his surroundings straight. He looked up in confusion, but that seemed to be enough for the man as he let out a sigh. "I was just asking if this was all right for you," he restated. All right, that's what the hero was worried about. He had already given him residence in a new home and a new room to himself, and he was wondering if it was all right. If Midoriya truly had a say in things, he'd scream about how it wasn't all right. That someone like him really didn't deserve nice things like this when there were kids like Todoroki. He was doing fine on his own. After all, he'd practically been on his own for 11 years. His situation wasn't anything of worth compared to all the other kids he knew were suffering out there. And yet, the boy knew he didn't have a say. He never had a say in his life so far, so why should he expect one now? His life had been governed so meticulously by the adults around him, he never expected more. And as nice as his English teacher was to him, in the end, he was the adult. He had the control. It almost made him break into laughter that the man bothered asking the question in the first place. After all, it was obvious he didn't care about whatever Midoriya said in return. It was like how people always start a greeting by asking how you're doing. The answer really doesn't matter to them. It's just a matter of being polite. And everyone always says they're doing good in return, even if they aren't. Because nobody cares about how you're doing, it's just how the formality goes. He personally wasn't sure if he would feel comfortable in a completely new room of a completely new house after his whole life had been pulled from under him. But who actually cared? Oh, yeah, this is fine. That's just how the formality goes. The room was pretty barren, which made sense considering it was a guest bedroom in Eraserhead's house. It was of a fair size, with a large, gray queen-sized bed in the corner. There was a nightstand on the bed's free side, a boring, black desk, and nothing more. The only thing that had really excited Midoriya about the room, other than the spacious bed, was the appealing window that stood right in front of the desk. It wasn't any different from a typical window, but the way it allowed the sunlight to flow into the room made everything feel so much brighter. Gami probably didn't like that though, so he'd have to get some curtains for it sometime. But the awe from the window only lasted a good half hour at best. The room wasn't all that entertaining, and it wasn't like he had much to do. There wasn't much homework, since it was only the second day of school, and what there was he had already completed at lunch. He did have his phone and a Quirk analysis notebook on him, but he couldn't bring himself to really use either. So he was simply sitting at the desk, flipping through his notebook for what was probably the millionth time. He wanted to lie on the bed, but he was still on his school clothes and really didn't want to make Aizawa or Yamada upset. He was a bit weary of sitting at the desk, but figured that if they walked in on him like that, it shouldn't bother them too much. Gami had tried to coax the teen out of the room, but his efforts were fruitless. Nothing he said or did could convince him to leave even the desk he was sitting at. Present Mike said this was his room, and that was his safe spot. He rarely ever was hurt in his room, and so that was where he felt the most comfortable. There was no telling what would happen to him if he left the room and went somewhere else. He had been listening closely, and hadn't heard the front door open, so that meant the hero was still in the house somewhere. What if the man caught him outside the room? He would most surely get upset, but the question was how upset? Upset enough to yell at him? Upset enough to punish him? Upset enough to take out his frustrations on him? There was no way he was leaving this room, not unless the house was empty or someone told him to. And Midoriya didn't care how long it took for one of those things to happen. He would be patient and he would wait. That was exactly how he survived with his mother for 11 years, after all. A sudden knock on the door startled him out of his thoughts. He fumbled in the desk chair a bit, its wheels squeaking on the hardwood floor. The sound dropped his heart rate a few beats, and he hoped that it was too quiet to be heard. "Hey Midoriya," a soft voice came from just beyond the door. He instantly recognized it as his English teacher, and wondered why he hadn't just opened the door yet. "I'm going back to UA to see how Shou's doing. I won't be gone long." Why was he telling him this? What would it matter how long he would be gone? Was this just another formality thing? That had to be it. It was the responsible thing to do, to tell him he would be leaving. Of course, Yamada didn't care how he felt about being alone. "All right," he replied just as quietly. There was a bit of a difference though. Present Mike's voice sounded more of an unsure quiet, while his was a SBMSSV quiet. Besides, he didn't have a problem with being left alone. In fact, he was waiting for this exact opportunity since he walked into the room. The boy wasn't sure how long he had been in the room, but based on the dim light coming in from the window, it had to have been a couple hours at least, and the slight rumbling from his stomach definitely tipped him off that it was getting late. The pro must have heard him, because he could hear the footsteps move away from his door and towards the front. The steps were distinct, echoing softly on the hardwood flooring. It sounded as if the hero wasn't wearing any shoes still. The teen felt the urge to walk up to his closed door, so he did, ever so quietly. He crept towards it and pressed his ear up against the wood. Gami followed him silently and stood at the wall next to the door. There, the two listened. They listened as the man approached the front door and the footsteps stopped. Midoriya took a shaky swallow. The feeling of déjà vu washed over him so heavily. He felt as if he'd drown in it. They listened, as both of them could make out the sound of shoes being slipped on and sliding against the doormat. The boy was positive the hero was putting on boots, specifically ones with strong soles. By the way they CLC'd against the floor. Maybe combat boots, maybe cowboy boots, he wasn't too sure on the type. They listened, as the jingle of house keys being taken off their hook pierced through the quiet air. That sound made him feel like throwing up. This felt so familiar, too familiar. His hands grew so cold and clammy. He wanted to tear his gloves off. Something was wrong. Wrong. He listened as the front door opened. The footsteps started up again. His heart P&D. He didn't realize he had left the safety of his room. Throwing open the door, he lunged for where he heard the footsteps roam moments before. "Dad, no," he cried desperately, tears clawing at the corner of his eyes. "Don't go." But the front door had already closed, Yamada long gone and unaware of the cries from the house behind him. Midoriya collapsed in the hallway, tears and sobs racking his entire body. His gloved fingers curled into his chest protectively, wringing his UA uniform into wrinkles. His breathing turned hysterical and unrestrained as Gami rushed to calm him. "Please, Dad," he called defeatedly. "Please don't go." The ghost wasn't sure what his successor was talking about. "Your father isn't here, Izu." "I'm sorry." He didn't seem to hear his mentor. "I'll be good. Please don't leave." That was Present Mike who left. "Not your father," the mysterious man tried to explain, but the boy just kept bawling. He kneeled down carefully and wrapped his arms around him gently. The teen was mumbling incoherent apologies, likely to his father as he had been doing in the seconds before. Gami wasn't too sure what his friend was going through, but he had his assumptions. The series of events right before his breakdown were eerily similar to ones from the boy's early childhood, specifically from right before his father's departure. It was plausible that the hero's leaving triggered a dormant memory of his father, but even then, he didn't really know how to help. "Izu, I just need you to breathe," he pleaded. "He is not here." The sobs started to quiet down, so the spirit figured he was headed in the right direction. He began running his bony hands through his successor's hair, and instantly heard his breathing slow. That was a trick the specter had learned in his years of companionship with Midoriya. For some reason, the gentle affection helped him calm down, or feel more comfortable. "Dad. No, he is not here," Gami repeated. "It is just me. Just Gami." That finally cleared the teen's head. "Gami, yes." And with that, he jumped onto the ghost with a large embrace, the sobs returning. The two hugged tightly, almost as if they hadn't seen each other in years. "I'm sorry," he wailed. "I just thought. I saw." He was. But the spirit merely shushed him and held him closer. "It is all right." In all honesty, he really had no idea how to handle a situation like this. Should he give it to the boy blunt and just say that his father was never coming back? Or should he console him and give him false hope, even just to boost his mood for the day? Both options felt dirty, so the ghost just tried to assure him that all was good. But even that didn't feel right. He wished he could do so much more for the broken boy in front of him. And Midoriya's stomach growled, ruining the sincerity of the moment. That made the teen burst into giggles, and he wiped the tears away. Gami too gave a small chuckle, but it was relatively silent compared to his successor. He lifted his crumpled form off the floor and dragged his feet into the kitchen. The house sported an open-concept floor, with the living room flowing into the kitchen quite nicely. The kitchen itself was fairly large and even had an island counter. He reached for the refrigerator handle to open it, but stopped abruptly. What was he doing? This wasn't his house, and he couldn't just take food that wasn't his. At least when he was living with his mother, he could buy his own food. That's what he used to cook his meals and feed himself. He made sure that there were no real grounds for his mother to get upset at him concerning food. But here, he didn't own any of the food. There was no way he could eat anything that wasn't his and get away with it. He recalled the first few times he had taken some of his mother's food without realizing the consequences, and the memories made him shudder. There was absolutely no way he would take something and risk rage like his mother's. But his stomach grumbled again, louder and more violent this time. He had been lucky enough to have eaten a full lunch at school today, considering he wasn't planning to, but it had been hours since that. Not to mention Recovery Girl had SCK his stamina dry. He was practically running on fumes, combined with his overactive imagination on what could be inside the fridge, and he was desperately battling the urge to yank open the handle. "What is it, Izu?" his mentor asked with concern. Right, he had been staring at the closed fridge for what was probably too long to be considered normal. "I can't take anything," he replied almost sadly, but calm enough to signify that this was normal to him. What do you mean?" "Well, it's Aizawa-sensei's food, I think." He still wasn't sure exactly who was living in this house. "I can't just take it." "I'm sure he will understand," the ghost tried to assure him. But Midoriya just shook his head. I'm not taking anything." Gami didn't really understand why the boy was resistant to taking some food, but he wasn't about to let him starve. Not on his watch, at least. "Why don't you cook a meal for everyone?" he pondered. "Isn't that just the same thing?" The teen questioned skeptically. The spirit wasn't too proud about tricking his successor, but he really needed the boy to eat something, even if it was under the guise of a selfless act. "No, you are cooking for them as well, not only yourself. They will be so pleased by the kind gesture that they may offer you a portion as well." He knew that the heroes wouldn't let the teen starve, even if they didn't like him. But he also knew that in his friend's trauma-ridden mind probably wouldn't see it like that. This was for his sake. "Yeah, that makes sense," he answered. That was thankfully enough to convince the teen as he opened up the refrigerator. But upon his flabbergasted expression, the ghost floated over to see what had caught his attention. The fridge was almost as barren as the guest room Midoriya had been given. There was barely any food on the shelves, and any that there was definitely didn't seem fresh. He almost seemed dejected at opening up the fridge. His imagination had hyped him up so much, and the disappointment hit strong. "Well, this is a letdown." That couldn't be more true. He shuffled through, pushing past containers of leftover food, searching for something decent enough to cook with. And even if he found something, what would he even make? He didn't really know what Aizawa liked. If he was going to use his food, the dish had to be perfect. He rummaged through some more and pulled out a container of white rice. Upon further examination, he guessed it was about 2 days old, which wasn't too bad. "I think there are some vegetables in the back," Gami commented. Midoriya hummed, but searched where his mentor had told him. Sure enough, there was a small container of steamed vegetables, so he took that out as well. It wasn't much, but it should be enough for 2 portions, maybe even 3. And still, rice and vegetables wasn't really enough to be considered a meal. He needed to find some sort of protein. Laying the rice and vegetables on the counter, he squatted back down to continue raiding the fridge. He scoured container after container, opening up ones he thought had what he was looking for. But either it wasn't exactly what he was looking for, or it smelled too funky for him to feel comfortable using. He could feel himself grow more frustrated by the minute, and his stomach more hungry. Is that not chicken back there? The teen's head swiveled towards the spirit's outstretched finger. Scrambling through the fridge, he pulled out a container and lifted open the lid. When the smell of chicken met his nose, he smiled in relief. This was definitely fresh enough to use, and he had a pretty good idea of what he was going to make. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Midoriya smirked. Most definitely. The kitchen was full of delicious aromas as the sizzle from the open skillet invaded the air. Midoriya flipped the vegetables sautéing in the pan before pulling them back on the stove top. He moved over to the counters, where he laid out 2 large plates and then a smaller one for himself. He didn't want to set out a plate for himself at first, thinking the heroes might get angry at him for serving himself with their food. But Gami managed to convince him to at least take out the plate. He didn't have to serve himself after all. The smell of scrambled eggs hit his nose strong, so he rushed over to the stove to check on them. He figured they were done since their edges were a crisp golden brown, so he slid them off the pan and onto a small plate. The ghost watched in amazement as his successor sliced up the eggs into microscopic pieces with a large chef knife. He loved watching the boy cook, and times like made him wish he could eat. He couldn't smell the countless scents that were currently whirling around the kitchen either, but he was certain they were mouth-watering. The teen then pushed the small pieces of scrambled eggs into the pan, sautéing the vegetables. Lowering the temperature so the bok choy and the broccoli florets wouldn't wilt, he set the pan down to check on the rice. He'd left that in a small pot with some water to boil, and the moisture rejuvenated the rice back to its sticky, fresher self. He opened the drawer where he discovered the utensils were and reached for a spoon, pushing past his nervous hesitation. He took one tiny taste of the rice, and his stomach's subsequent growl confirmed it was ready. He snagged the 2 oven mitts from their resting spot on top of a hanging cabinet and slipped them over his own gloves. Carefully, he gripped the pot's handles and carried it over to the dining room table, which he set before he started cooking. Still with the mitts on, he scurried back and took the vegetables off the stove top as well, placing them next to the rice. Having just a bit of time left, he quickly placed each plate down in front of a chair, leaving his own on the counter. That looks amazing, Izu. But aren't you missing the... Midoriya held up one oven mitt, silencing his companion, and just as he did, the oven beeped. He turned off the oven completely, before opening it up and sticking both hands inside. He slowly pulled out beautifully breaded strips of chicken and brought that to the table as well. Once that was done, he took off the mitts and stepped back to admire his work. You really outdid yourself this time, especially considering the ingredients you had to work with, the spirit praised. I just hope they like katsudon. He murmured back, ignoring the praise entirely. I mean, I don't even know who's coming back. Is it going to be Aizawa-sensei, or Mike-sensei, or both of them? I am sure that whoever comes back will enjoy this, the transparent man reassured. I know I sure would. Well, I'm not sure when anyone will be back, he sighed. Let me at least put the covers back on so the food doesn't get cold. And with that, the boy leaned over the table and placed glass lids on all the pots and pans, sealing the warmth with the food. His stomach churned at the sight and he clutched it tightly, hoping to quiet himself down. Gami looked over with concern. Why not serve yourself now? I am sure they will not mind. But Midoriya was unfazed. No, I'll wait. The ghost tried to press more, but his successor walked away to put cups on the table. He sighed and stared at the food the boy had made. The man waved a hand towards one of the serving utensils, but it only went through. His shoulders slumped dejectedly. He could only hope those heroes got back soon so his friend could eat. The teen wished he had his kettle so he could make tea, but alas, he did not. So instead, he settled for water. Reaching for the pitcher, he set that down on the table as well. With that, he figured the table was complete. Now, it was best for him to retreat back into the guest room until whoever arrived. He was afraid that if the heroes saw him and realized he had used their food to cook, they would be too angry to care that the meal was for them. But if he was out of sight by the time they came back, then the heroes would have no choice but to check out what he made. It wasn't a foolproof plan, but it was his best shot at maintaining peace as well as maybe getting some dinner. He figured that he had a few moments to spare, so he stood by the table and just took in the savory aromas and the serene calmness. He felt his heartstrings sigh. What he wouldn't give for a warm meal right now and a family to share it with. Only around half a minute had passed, and while he knew he should get going, the longing in his heart figured 30 seconds more wouldn't hurt. The front door opened abruptly. Well, thanks to the stupid longing in his heart, he was now royally screwed. Sho, I just don't understand why you're so against this. Yamada was looking behind him as he unlocked the door and didn't see Midoriya or the cooked meal right away. I think you may be overreacting a bit. Look, Sashi, I already explained this to you on the way here, Aizawa remarked and walked inside. That's when the teacher's eyes met Midoriya's petrified ones. He stopped talking immediately and just stared at the boy in front of him. Yamada noticed the silence and looked into the house as well, looking for what exactly shut the man up. His eyes landed on the student too, and then moved over to the fully set table. The timid boy felt all the color drain from his face when that front door swung open. What should he do? Should he just make a run for the room? Should he just try and wait it out? Should he say something? Or wait for one of his teachers to say something first? He was stuck in his own head again, slowly drowning himself in his panic. And yet, even through all of that, his brain just narrowed in on the fact that this all felt so familiar. He was being hit by some major déjà vu again. Midoriya, present Mike started softly, "What did you do?" But the teen completely took that the wrong way. He had messed up. This was exactly why he needed to be tucked away in the room before anyone came home. Aizawa took one big sniff of the air. "You cooked. What food did you even use?" That made the boy's BLD pressure spike even higher than what it was before. This was a terrible idea. He shouldn't have dared to touch food that wasn't his. Hadn't he learned his lesson with his mother? He stuttered, fear prickling at his fingertips. But the rational man took an intimidating step forward, tossing what looked to be a folder onto the couch. Midoriya took a small step backwards in fear, afraid of the closing gap between the two of them. Aizawa eyed the food on the table in confusion, speaking his thoughts aloud. "All I had in that fridge was leftovers. How did you even make that?" The teacher moved another step closer, so the teen took two back. His sock caught a nail sticking up slightly from the hardwood and sent him tumbling down. He landed roughly on his rear, but that did nothing to shake him out of the paralyzing fear that racked his whole body. "I am sorry." His voice wavered wetly, the tears to his eyes stopping by his throat first. Aizawa softened a little, but the boy was too terrified to notice. "Problem child, just get off the floor." "What are you doing on the floor there, Izuku dear?" No, he stammered. "Please. Have I ever told you how much you look like your father?" He raised his hands to his ears, hoping to block the harrowing cries out. "I'm sorry." The normally tired man looked back to Yamada in distress, unsure of how to handle the situation in front of him. Even the blonde, with the vast amount of experience dealing with children in his career of being a UA teacher, never dealt with one as emotionally distressed as the one in front of him. "It made me so sad when he left." "How could you make your own mother so sad?" "Please, I won't." Midoriya was sorry. How much more could he stress that? "I won't do it again." Aizawa wasn't sure what the boy was apologizing for, but whatever it was, it seemed to be causing him a lot of stress. He was still on the floor, covering his ears closely and trembling violently. And while he had dealt with his fair share of children, he never really got involved with the ones that UA pulled from their homes. He couldn't understand why Nezu had chosen him to foster this kid, other than the fact that he was a student in his class. He wasn't good with kids. He couldn't handle a situation like this. But despite his inexperience, he couldn't just leave him on the floor. So he removed one hand from his pocket and outstretched it towards the prone teen, offering it to hoist him up. When the boy didn't take it, or even react to it, he took a few more steps forward, now slightly looming over him. "Why oh why? Why have you done this to me, Izuku?" Midoriya scrambled to his feet and turned tail, his breathing becoming erratic. His sudden movement surprised both teachers, but Aizawa snapped out of it quickly. His hero instincts kicked in and he chased after the frightened student. The pro called out for him, but wasn't answered. The teen couldn't hear anything but the overwhelming sound of his heartbeat in his ears as he scampered down the hallway. He didn't have to hear the footsteps behind him to know he was being chased down. He turned the corner and dashed towards the guest room. The door was so close, he could almost reach it. His whole body was shivering in utter panic. But he pushed himself to keep running. He couldn't get caught. He couldn't let himself get caught. Every time he did, it hurt. Every time he did, she hurt him. He bursted into the room, using his shoulder as a battering ram. His lungs ached from the invasive sobs as well as his dash to safety. But he couldn't rest yet. He had skidded to a stop a few feet away from the door, and he needed to lock it. Turning around, he almost broke down in terror at seeing someone running right towards the room. He lunged for the door. She had never been this fast before. Why was she so fast? She was going to reach the room before he could make it to the door. He wasn't going to get to the door in time. She was going to catch him. No. Gami flung into the door from inside the room, and his shoulder slammed it shut. His fingers flew to the lock and he CLC'd that closed too. He had no time to ponder his solidity as his successor was still mid-dive. The ghost zoomed over and caught the boy before he could face plant onto the hardwood. He cradled him closely with his oversized sleeves as the boy blubbered out inaudibles and incoherence. Then, Aizawa slammed into the door. The bang scared more sobs out of the crumpled teen, but his mentor held him close. Running soft-s through his unruly hair, the spirit just tried to comfort him. But what he didn't realize was that the bang was echoing through Midoriya's head, and it sounded an awful lot like fists bashing on a door. "Why did you drive Hisashi away from me? Why did you have to be quirkless? Don't you realize what you have done to me? I'm sorry, he wailed into his mentor's arms. Please, I'm sorry. Izu, I do not understand. The boy gripped the ghost's robe tightly. Please don't let her in. Her. The specter repeated, I do not know. Then it hit him. His mother. Midoriya was talking about his mother. But she wasn't here right now, so what was he talking about? Was this related to the episode he had earlier, where he had mistaken present Mike for his father? Izu, that is not your mother. She is not here, he tried to explain. He looked up at the ghost, fat tears still streaming down his face. Biba, Gami couldn't let this go on any longer. That was Eraserhead, not her. After that statement, the wails quieted down into sniffles, the teen's panic changing into realization. But unlike the first time, he stuttered out no words. Together, they sat there on the floor, not caring how many minutes went by. No noise came from beyond the door either, just empty silence. Empty, appealing silence. The minutes turned to hours, and Midoriya hadn't dared to leave the room. He could hear hushed whispers coming from just beyond the hallway, but no matter how close he pressed his ear to the wall, they were too muffled to understand. He had passed the time by messing around with some souls. Originally, he was trying to get some sorting done, but his mind was the further place from responsibility right now. So he SWCH to instead tossing them from hand to hand, wishing he could feel more of the bright warmth that radiated from some. After some moments of recollection, the boy had realized how much he had FCK'd up. It hadn't even been a full day yet, and he was sure Aizawa would want him gone. He wasn't worth all the trouble he was. Times like now he wished the universe would have pity on him and just erase him from existence. Gami had enough of watching his successor just mope around and sulk. His friend did that practically every day, and he wanted to see it changed. Why don't you do something different? He suggested, nudging the soul out of the teen's hand. Like what? He moaned drearily. The ghost motioned to something that lay on the desk. But from the floor, Midoriya couldn't see what it was. So he shakily rose to his feet and shuffled over to the desk. The only thing on it was his phone, his notebook somewhere else in his backpack. He wasn't sure what his mentor had in mind, but he grabbed it anyway and moved back to his spot on the floor. He tossed his phone from hand to hand, but Gami quickly put an end to that. That is not what I meant. The teen rolled his eyes sarcastically, but stopped throwing the device around. He unlocked it and CLCK'd through some of the applications, opening up his news feed to check if there was anything interesting on there. Sadly, there wasn't, so he exited out of that. He raised his finger to press something else, his gloves working on the touchscreen surprisingly, when the spirit gave him a strong nudge, changing his hand's trajectory. Hey, he whined, what was that for? Sorry, the man huffed, my bad. Midoriya was not convinced. Are you being sarcastic with me right now? Me, never. Gami faked some shocked body language, since his face couldn't be seen. The boy just shook his head and looked back down at his phone. Because of the push, his finger ended up seeking his contacts instead. The list was pretty barren, probably even more so than the room he was currently staying in. There were only 3 numbers in his phone. The first was Ishihara's old number. He couldn't bring himself to delete the number, even though he couldn't call the man anymore. The family must have still kept the phone number in circulation because anytime he CLCK'd on it and let it dial, he was met with the voicemail, not a machine telling him the number was out of circulation. Sometimes, on days that were particularly rough, he let it ring just to hear the man's voice again. But he didn't really think today was a day he needed it, especially since it usually made him cry afterwards. He had done enough of that already. The second was some old food DLVRY service. He used it on nights he wasn't able to cook, or didn't feel like it, which wasn't often. It was fairly expensive, enough for him to deem the service only for special occasions or dire emergencies. But the katsudon they made was delicious. It rejuvenated the fading memories of when his mother used to cook dinner for him and brought him warmth on days that were especially cold, both physically and emotionally. The third and final number was Todoroki's, from earlier today. It was appropriately named Sho, at least, in the ghost's opinion. His eyes hovered over the name. Here, we'll figure this out together. Sure, the boy had offered his assistance concerning his situation, but could Midoriya truly burden him with his complaints? His morals told him that wasn't right, but he still eyed the name like it was an option. His finger hung over the contact. All it would take would be one push, but he'd then be roping the student into his own problems. This was probably another formality thing. Todoroki was only offering his help to be polite. He didn't really mean for the offer to be taken up. The specter sensed his successor's hesitation and moved in for the assist. There was no way he was going to let the boy self-doubt himself out of this one. This was all part of his MSDR plan after all. He knew his friend needed a trustworthy, reliable person to confide in, and he figured Todoroki was just the friend Midoriya needed. Why don't you just send him a text? He proposed sneakily, just wanting to slip the idea into the boy's mind. It does not even need to be about this. He hummed in contemplation, weighing the ghost's words. He was right. The text didn't even need to be about the turmoil he was currently going through. Just something short and pleasant. so he CLC'd on the contact and started typing. Hey, this is Izuku from class. How are you? He hit the send button nervously. Was that too informal? Maybe he should have been more specific about what class. Should he have said class 1A? His doubts were whirling through his head. This was a mistake. He never should have done this in the first place. But his phone dinged back and cut through his suffocating thoughts like a knife. He picked it up for a read. Hey Izuku, I am doing all right, though that may be because I have not run into my father yet. What about you? He wasn't sure if Todoroki was trying to make a joke or was genuinely serious, though, based on the boy's personality, he figured it was more likely the latter. Though, how should he respond back? He thought about it for a moment. There was no real need to involve Todoroki in his issues. Besides, this was just how the formality went. I'm doing good. Just chilling, I guess. God, now that he was reading that text back, he felt himself cringe into yesterday. He had never texted another classmate before, much less a friend. How was he supposed to know what to say or how to talk? Did you figure out your living situation? Todoroki always went straight to the point. He didn't want to lie to the boy, but at the same time, he didn't need to spill all the details. Yeah, he face-palmed. That was too obnoxious of an answer. Why did he even text Todoroki in the first place? He was too stupid for this. So, what happened then? Well, he certainly didn't know when to quit. A lot of people he once admired were like that. Bakugo, All Might. Did this mean his friendship with Todoroki was destined to fail? You do not have to tell him, but I do not think he means any harm. Maybe Gami was right. Midoriya certainly couldn't remember a time when the ghost wasn't. He could give this friendship with Todoroki a shot. Principal Nezu sent me off with Aizawa-sensei, but from what I've seen, Mike-sensei lives here too. That was all the truth. Though, he still wasn't sure what relationship his English teacher had with his homeroom teacher. Oh, is that all working out well? This was it. He either told Todoroki the entire story, or kept him in the dark. He let himself have a few moments to think it over, but he was surprisingly torn. So he looked over to his mentor for guidance. The spirit knew he would have to be the tiebreaker here. This was really important to the boy, but he didn't have to give it any more thought. He knew his answer. This was all for his sake. He confided in you that first day. Give him a chance. That was all the convincing he needed. Well, not really. I don't think Aizawa-sensei likes me here very much. It didn't take long for his phone to ping again. Oh, why is that? Right, Todoroki didn't know anything that happened in the nurse's office. He'd forgotten about that. Well, Nezu-san must have made the decision by himself, because even Aizawa-sensei was surprised. Plus I had a really bad panic attack in front of him. I've been hiding out in the guest room since. I think I annoy him. Shoot, was that too much information? He purposely left out the panic attack he had after President Mike left, deeming that unimportant to the conversation since no one was around to witness it. But even still, he might have overshared. A panic attack. What did he do? He could feel the murderous intent coming off that single message. Was Todoroki really that concerned over him? Maybe it wasn't just a formality thing. It wasn't really his fault. There was a situation. It just reminded me too much of something from my childhood. I kind of freaked out and ran. There were a few moments of silence, then another ding. Are you all right now? Midoriya didn't hesitate with his response. Yeah, I'm good. Just needed a breather, I guess. He had needed much more than a breather, but Todoroki didn't need to know that. A soft knock came from upon the door, startling the phone right out of his hands. It landed with a soft thud against the hardwood, but other than that it was fine. Yamada's voice rang out. Hey Midoriya, it's been almost an hour. Do you want to join us for dinner? Wait, really? Even after all that had happened, they were still offering him food. His stomach was surely empty. He couldn't pass up an offer like this. Why yeah, if that's okay. He added another comment quickly. I'll be out in a minute. He listened as the loud man's footsteps moved away from the door until they disappeared into the distance. He then picked his phone off the floor and sent one last serve of messages to Todoroki. I have to go. Dinner and all that. Talk to you later. He set the phone down on the desk and wearily walked out of the room, shutting the door behind him. Gami followed him out, phasing right through the wall instead. Midoriya had left so quickly though, he failed to hear one last ping. All right, stay safe. By the time Midoriya arrived at the table, Yamada was already seated. It was a small rectangular table, and Aizawa sat at one side along with the English teacher. The two adults had already served themselves, each a plate of rice, topped with evenly sauteed vegetables and chicken. Even an hour later, the smell was still delightfully potent in the air, and it made his stomach growl. Like an injured animal, he wandered over to the table wearily, waiting for instructions. He didn't make eye contact with either man, instead opting to look at his feet. He couldn't see either of them analyzing him with terrifying intent. President Mike was the first to speak up, but he usually was. The man's announcer tendencies carried with him throughout his daily life, and it naturally shined through even when he didn't mean it to. Midoriya, he started, you can sit down wherever you'd like. The boy nodded quietly, but made no comment. He sat down in a chair of his own, on a side completely to himself. There really wasn't any room for him to sit on the same side as the teachers anyway, even if he wanted to. Yamada passed him a plate. It wasn't one of the small ones that he had set out for himself earlier. It was the same size as the other two that were out. That surprised him, but he dared not to say a word about it, risk it getting SWCH out. He took the plate from the pro's outstretched hand and set it down in front of him. But even then, he didn't serve himself right away. He had never really eaten with anyone in a long time. Sure, these past 2 days, he had lunch with Uraraka and Ada, but 2 isolated incidents didn't really change years of past experiences. Both teachers watched as the teen simply stared at his empty plate. It was almost like he had never eaten with others before. You can serve yourself whatever you want. The blonde piped up for both of them. You don't have to wait for instructions or anything. Gami added his 2 cents. Just take advantage of the situation. This is a tasteful meal you cooked. Now you get to have a portion of it. That gave Midoriya the confidence he needed to grip the serving spoon for the rice. He plowed it into the mound of rice in the pot and scooped up a small portion from himself. The entire time he moved it onto his plate, he watched the heroes carefully. He eyed them suspiciously, as if they'd take back their generosity any second. Then he moved to the vegetables, and then the chicken, but not without losing his apprehensiveness. But the pros never changed their mind about the food, and while that would normally be a calming thing, it only made him more paranoid. He poked at his food nervously, not really sure if he should start. But the smell eventually got to his raging stomach and he took a bite. The mess of flavors exploded in his mouth, only amplified by his hunger. It was delicious, more delicious than he could have ever imagined. Part of his overly anxious mind was expecting one of the adults to take the food away from him, so he began shoveling mouthful after mouthful, not wanting to waste a single second. Yamada had already started his food before Midoriya had, but he was flabbergasted at the boy's eating speed. He was already almost finished with his plate, and the teacher was barely halfway done. He was worried the student might choke, so he attempted to make some light-hearted conversation like he had done on the way to the house. "So Midoriya," he began, "I didn't know you could cook. This katsudon is really good." The teen swallowed the mound of rice in his mouth thickly. "Why yeah, I'm just glad you think it's okay. Sorry about using your food without asking." The 2 teachers shared a puzzled glance. Was that the reason for the mess that happened earlier? If it was, what did that reveal about this kid's home life? Was he not allowed to touch the food at home? The blonde tried to make some progress amending the situation. "Oh, it's really no problem. Those leftovers would have probably gone to waste anyway." Still, that didn't ease the boy's worries. He didn't respond to the comments, and dinner fell into uncomfortable silence. Aizawa still didn't make any efforts to join into the conversation, and Yamada was becoming frustrated. He racked his brain for a good way to get the man into the discussion. "Hey Sho," he started, surprising both the teacher and the student. "Did you know that Midoriya here likes to analyze quirks?" Aizawa shot a glare at the loud man. "No, I didn't." "Well, he does, and he's super good at it," he practically yelled. "The little listener's even done some notes on you." That caught the pro's attention. "Oh." Both adults looked over to Midoriya, one in excitement and one in dulled interest. The teen felt his face go pale and his throat ran dry. This was such a 180 from before, and he wasn't sure how to feel about it. Gami placed a bony hand on his successor's left shoulder. "Just take your time," the ghost advised. "You do not have to share more than you are comfortable with." He gave the spirit a slight nod and turned back to face his homeroom teacher. Well, your quirk is erasure. It lets you erase non-mutant type quirks when you look at someone." Aizawa jumped in, seemingly annoyed. "Well, that's obvious." Yamada elbowed him strong under the table, and the ragged man cursed under his breath. "Don't mind him, please continue." The boy's confidence caved in strong. He felt his passion for the conversation die off. He really didn't want to keep talking, but it would be rude to just leave now. He shoveled in the last few bites left on his plate and pushed his utensils to the side. It's fine," he stuttered. "I'll just get you my notebook. It's got some of my notes on Aizawa-sensei." He stood up from his chair and scurried off back to the guest room. Once the boy was mostly out of earshot, the blonde turned to face his fellow teacher. "Sho, what are you doing?" he hissed. "I get that you don't think you're qualified for this, but that doesn't give you a reason to be a jackass to the kid." Aizawa was taken aback by the use of foul language. "FCK, I'm sorry Zashi." He held a hand up to his forehead and ran the other through his messy hair. "I'm not asking you to apologize," the pro continued. "I'm asking for you to give this your full effort." The tired man tried to backtrack. "I already told you I." "Well, you're not," he almost yelled, but kept his voice under control. The sudden interruption caught Aizawa off guard and he promptly shut up. Yamada scooted his chair closer and brought his voice down to a whisper. "Look, we still don't know the full extent of what this kid went through. We have to treat this with care and sensitivity, especially after whatever happened earlier. And you purposely being a jerk isn't helping." Eraserhead sighed, knowing he was completely in the wrong. "You're right. But that wasn't enough for present Mike, and I'll try and do better." That's what I like to hear, the loud blonde smiled. The two quickly shut their mouths as a set of footsteps from the hallway grew louder. Their hero instincts kicked in and they slowed their breathing to make less noise. Both could make out slight whispers and strained to hear more. Don't get me wrong, I am curious. The next set of words were muffled by footsteps. But the footsteps eventually quieted down. I can't just ask them that. That'll just give them more reasons to not want me around. The teachers didn't bother to pretend they weren't eavesdropping when Midoriya turned the corner and reappeared into the dining room. He was holding a thin notebook in one hand, a little battered but in good condition overall. He looked startled to see them there, and jumped slightly when making eye contact. Aizawa cut straight to the point. Ask us what? Yamada noticed the boy squirm under the piercing gaze and gave a look to the man next to him. Eraserhead immediately softened, but kept up his neutral facade. Gami's a bit confused on what exactly your relationship is. Between you and Mike-sensei, I mean, he added another comment under his breath. I'm a little curious too. Present Mike watched the other hero carefully. He wasn't going to say anything. This was the perfect opportunity for him to see how Aizawa would handle this situation. He hoped the hero took their little heart-to-heart seriously. This was his chance. The ragged pro just sighed. Yamada and I are married. Have been for a good 5 years now. Midoriya was surprised at the blunt answer. Oh. I'm going to ask you to keep this under wraps for obvious reasons, he continued, but the smugness in his voice was gone. The amount of media attention around relationships between pro heroes is fatal to anyone underground. Why yeah, he replied, will do. The boy stood there awkwardly for a few moments, no one in the room saying a word. Then he slid the notebook onto the table, away from the food. Here's the book, he clarified. Aizawa-sensei is on pages 48 to 52, and there's a little more on page 117. What about me? Present Mike joked. The teen seemed to understand it was a joke and smothered a laugh. You're in a different book? Sorry. The two shared a smile and the student instantly felt more at ease. He reached for one of the pots in the middle of the table and wrapped his hand around the handle. The blonde teacher looked confused. What are you doing? He asked a little too quickly. Midoriya immediately flinched back and let go of the handle. I was just going to put the food away. Aizawa felt like it was a good time to jump in. Don't worry about it, problem child. We'll pick it all up later. He clearly wasn't expecting the nice gesture from the intimidating pro, but he didn't shy away as much. Okay. He didn't feel the need to stick around in the dining room anymore, so he quietly started moving towards the hallway entrance. The boy still had a lot of souls to send away before he went to bed, and the earlier he started, the better. Yamada noticed the student trying to retreat and stood up slowly from his chair, understanding from his quick question that suddenness made the teen uncomfortable. Midoriya, he called out, but kept his volume steady. Said boy stopped in his tracks and looked back behind him. Yes, the answer was so small, so scared that it almost made the hero forget about his thought in the first place. If you need anything, or if there's anything we can do for you, just let us know. He nodded and turned to leave, but only a few steps later, he flipped back around and called out shakily, Can you not call me Midoriya? Anything else is fine. Present Mike flashed a friendly thumbs up. No problem, little listener. Aizawa chuckled from the table. Pretty sure I've already got that under control. Both conformations were enough for the teen to feel comfortable leaving, and so that's exactly what he did. The two heroes listened as his footsteps grew fainter and fainter, until they couldn't hear them at all. A subsequent groan of a door on its hinges was all they needed to hear to confirm he had made it to his room. Present Mike turned to his husband, knowing the boy was out of earshot. Who exactly is Gami? Aizawa just let out an exasperated sigh. I'm not explaining that right now.